60 missed calls. That was what I saw when I finally turned my phone back on. 60 missed calls, 23 text messages, 7 voicemails. Every single one from people who hadn't bothered to stand up for me 2 days earlier. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the screen while my husband drank coffee across from me. Outside, a light Virginia snow drifted past the window. Inside, my phone kept vibrating. Mom, Dad, my brother Michael, my Aunt Carol, my cousin Jim, even relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, the same people who had watched my father reject my family at his front door, the same people who had said absolutely nothing. I picked up the phone and listened to the first voicemail. My mother's voice was shaking. "Sarah, please call us back. Something's happened." I deleted it. Then I played the second one. This time it was my father. "Sarah, we need to talk." 2 days earlier, he hadn't wanted to talk. 2 days earlier, he had blocked a doorway. Funny how quickly things can change. But before I tell you why my phone suddenly became the most popular number in Ohio, I need to tell you how we ended up standing on that front porch in the first place. Because family stories don't start with a single bad day. They start with years of small moments that people pretend not to notice. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 42 years old. I've served in the United States Navy for almost 20 years. At the time all this happened, I was stationed near Norfolk, Virginia, working as a commander responsible for logistics operations. It wasn't glamorous work. Nobody made movies about it. But I was proud of it. I had spent most of my adult life serving my country. What mattered more to me, though, was the family I had built. My husband David taught American history at a public high school. He was patient, thoughtful, and the exact opposite of me in many ways. Where I liked schedules and plans, David liked conversations and possibilities. Where I was practical, he was compassionate. Together we balanced each other. And then there was Emily, David's daughter from his first marriage, 14 years old.
Right.
Funny, a little shy. I met her when she was 7. By the time this story begins, I honestly forgot she wasn't biologically mine. She was simply my daughter. At least to me. Unfortunately, not everyone felt that way, especially my father. Christmas leave had been difficult to get that year. The Navy wasn't exactly generous with holiday scheduling. Several officers were competing for the same dates. I pulled favors, traded assignments, and rearranged commitments just to make it happen. When my leave was finally approved, I called my mother. "Looks like we're coming home for Christmas." She sounded thrilled. "Your father will be happy." That should have been my first warning. Whenever Mom told me how someone else would feel, it usually meant she wasn't sure herself. Still, I ignored it. I wanted a good Christmas. I wanted normal. The drive from Virginia to Ohio took almost 14 hours with holiday traffic. David drove the first stretch. I took over after lunch. Emily slept in the back seat with headphones on. We passed frozen fields, small towns, truck stops, and church signs decorated for Christmas Eve services. The farther north we drove, the more excited I became. Not because my childhood had been perfect. It hadn't. But because some part of me still hoped things would get better. Maybe that's what daughters do. No matter how old they get, they keep hoping. As we crossed into Ohio, David reached over and squeezed my hand. "You okay?" "Just tired." "You nervous?" "A little." He smiled knowingly. "Your father—" I laughed. "Is it that obvious?" "It has been 15 years, Sarah." He wasn't wrong. David knew my family history almost as well as I did, especially where my father was concerned. Tom Mitchell wasn't a bad man, at least not in the way people usually mean. He never drank too much. Never gambled, never disappeared. He worked hard his entire life, provided for his family, paid his bills, went to church, helped neighbors. By most standards, he was respectable. But there was one thing my father had never figured out: how to love people who didn't fit the picture in his head. And nobody fit that picture less than me. Growing up, my younger brother Michael was the center of Dad's world. Michael liked sports. Dad loved sports. Michael hunted. Dad hunted. Michael stayed close to home. Dad approved. Then there was me. I read books, joined debate club, left Ohio, joined the military, married a teacher, became a stepmother. Every major decision I made seemed to disappoint him. He never said it directly. Not often. Instead, he communicated through sighs, looks, comments disguised as jokes. "You always were stubborn. You never do things the easy way." Well, that's certainly different. Over time, I learned how to translate. Different meant wrong. Independent meant difficult. Successful meant surprising. By the time we pulled into my parents' neighborhood, snow covered the lawns and rooftops. The house looked exactly the same as it had 20 years earlier. White siding, green shutters, The same wreath hanging on the front door. Mom's minivan sat in the driveway. Michael's truck was already there. I checked my watch. We were right on time. David grabbed gifts from the trunk. Emily carried a pie we'd bought at a bakery along the way. We walked up the front steps together. For one brief moment, everything felt hopeful. Then the front door opened. My father stepped outside. Not inside. Outside. That should have been my second warning. He didn't smile. Didn't say Merry Christmas. Didn't hug me. He simply stood in the doorway, blocking it. I stopped walking. Hi, Dad. His eyes moved past me. Toward David. Toward Emily. Then he folded his arms. Blood family only. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. What? Blood family only. His voice was calm, almost casual, as if he were discussing the weather. He pointed directly at my husband and my stepdaughter. They don't belong here. The world went strangely quiet. I could hear Christmas music playing inside the house. I could smell turkey. Someone laughed in another room. Nobody came to the door. Nobody interrupted. Emily's hand found mine. I felt her fingers trembling. David stood completely still. My father looked at me expectantly, waiting, as if this were perfectly reasonable, as if I should simply understand. Years of disappointment suddenly became crystal clear. Not because of what he said, because of how easily he said it. Like he'd been thinking it for years. I looked past him. I saw relatives gathered around the dining room table. Some noticed what was happening. None moved. None spoke. My father waited. I nodded once. Got it. Then I turned around, took Emily's hand, walked back to the car, and drove away. The first 30 minutes of the drive were completely silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence. Not the kind that exists between people who don't need words. This silence felt heavy. It sat in the car with us, beside us, between us. Snow drifted across the highway while Christmas lights faded in the distance behind us. I kept both hands on the steering wheel. My eyes stayed fixed on the road. If I looked at David or Emily, I knew I might cry. And I wasn't ready to do that yet. Finally, David spoke. Do you want me to drive? I shook my head. No. A few more miles passed. Then Emily's voice came quietly from the back seat. Did I do something wrong? The question hit harder than anything my father had said. I looked into the rearview mirror. She was staring down at her hands. 14 years old. Old enough to understand rejection. Too young to deserve it. No, sweetheart. Then why didn't Grandpa want me there? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because what answer could I give? Should I tell her that some people value blood more than love? Should I explain that my father had spent decades deciding who belonged and who didn't? Should I tell her that the problem wasn't her? David turned around in his seat. This isn't about you. She nodded politely, the way children do when they know adults are trying to protect them. But I could see the hurt in her eyes, and that hurt would stay with me long after Christmas ended. We stopped at a roadside diner 3 hours later. Nobody was hungry. Still, David insisted. You need coffee? Probably. And Emily needs food. That earned the first small smile of the day from her. Inside the diner was warm. An older waitress wearing a Santa pin greeted us. Merry Christmas. 3 simple words. Nothing special. Yet somehow they nearly broke me. Because strangers had shown us more kindness than my own father. We sat in a booth near the window. Emily ordered pancakes. David ordered soup. I ordered coffee and barely touched it. The waitress noticed. You folks traveling? Heading back to Virginia. Long drive. I nodded. Very long. She smiled sympathetically. Well, wherever you're going, I hope it's home. After she walked away, none of us spoke for a moment. Then David reached across the table. She has no idea how right she is. That was when the tears finally came. Not dramatic tears. Not sobbing. Just quiet tears running down my face while Christmas music played softly through the restaurant speakers. I wiped them away quickly. Emily got up from her seat and slid into the booth beside me. Without saying anything, she leaned her head against my shoulder. That was family. Not blood. Not DNA. Not legal documents. Just showing up when someone hurts. By the time we got home late that night, all 3 of us were exhausted. I carried luggage inside while David started a fire in the living room. Emily went upstairs. A few minutes later, she came back down carrying a small wrapped package. I was going to give this to Grandpa. She placed it on the coffee table. I recognized the wrapping paper. She had spent 2 weeks making that gift. A framed photo collage of family memories, vacations, birthdays, school events, pictures that included my parents, pictures that included her, pictures she clearly believed mattered. Now she wasn't sure. "Do you still want to send it?" I asked gently. She stared at the package, then shook her head. "No. That one word told me everything." Children rarely remember exact conversations, but they remember how people make them feel. And my father had made her feel unwanted. The next morning I woke before sunrise. Years in the Navy had trained my body to ignore weekends and holidays. I made coffee and sat alone in the kitchen. For the first time in a long time, I let myself think honestly about my father. Not the version I kept defending. The real version. The one I'd spent years making excuses for. The truth was that Christmas hadn't come out of nowhere. It was simply the latest chapter. There had been dozens before it. I remembered graduating high school at the top of my class. Dad skipped the ceremony because Michael had a baseball tournament. I remembered receiving my Navy commission. Dad attended but spent most of the event complaining about travel expenses. I remembered buying my first home. Dad congratulated me by asking whether I planned to settle down and find a normal career. The pattern was always the same. Michael's achievements were celebrated. Mine were evaluated. Michael received praise. I received advice. And whenever I pointed it out, Mom would say, "That's just how your father is." A phrase familiar to millions of Americans. 3 generations of emotional damage hidden behind 7 simple words. "That's just how he is." As if that excused everything. By lunchtime, messages from relatives started arriving. Not unusual holiday greetings. Questions. "Where are you? Why did you leave? What happened?" Apparently, several family members had noticed our absence after dinner. Nobody had stopped us from leaving. But some were curious afterward. I ignored every message. I wasn't interested in reliving the scene. Later that afternoon, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, she called again. Then again. And again. By evening, there were 9 missed calls. David noticed. "You going to answer?" "No." "You sure?" "Very." For once, I didn't feel guilty. That surprised me. Normally, I would have rushed to fix things. Smooth things over. Keep the peace. But something had changed on that front porch. Maybe I had finally reached my limit. Or maybe seeing Emily get hurt had done what decades of personal disappointment couldn't. It forced me to stop pretending. That evening, we started our own Christmas celebration. Just the 3 of us. We ordered takeout. Watched an old movie. Opened presents. Laughed. Slowly, the tension eased. By bedtime, Emily seemed happier. David seemed relaxed. Even I felt lighter. Then the next morning, everything changed. I woke up and discovered my phone had been accidentally left on silent overnight. The screen lit up like a Christmas tree. Missed calls, texts, voicemails. Dozens of them. Far more than before. I frowned. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Because nobody calls that many times unless there's a crisis. I counted. 20 calls. Then 30. Then 40. By noon, the number had climbed even higher. My stomach tightened. I looked at David. He looked back at me. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I picked up the phone and saw a voicemail from someone I never expected. Grandma Rose's attorney. I stared at the screen for several seconds before opening the voicemail. Grandma Rose's attorney. That alone was unusual. The man handled estate planning trusts and legal paperwork for my grandmother. He wasn't someone who casually called family members during Christmas week. I pressed play. "Commander Mitchell, this is Richard Harlan. Please contact me as soon as possible regarding your grandmother. Nothing is wrong medically, but there have been some significant developments that require your attention." The message ended. I listened again. Then a third time. David was standing beside me. "What does that mean?" "I have absolutely no idea." My phone rang again before I could say anything else. "Mom." I declined the call. Immediately another one appeared. "Dad." Declined. Then Michael. Declined. The phone rang so many times that it almost became ridiculous. The people who couldn't be bothered to stop my humiliation were suddenly desperate to reach me. I wasn't interested in rewarding that behavior. Not yet. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I called Mr. Harlan's office. He answered personally. "Commander Mitchell." "Mr. Harlan, what's going on?" There was a brief pause. "I think it would be better discussed in person." "I'm in Virginia." "I understand." Another pause. Then he sighed. "Your grandmother made several major legal changes on Christmas Day." I sat down slowly. "What kind of changes?" "Changes involving her estate trust administration and charitable foundation." My stomach tightened. Grandma Rose wasn't wealthy in the billionaire sense, but she had done very well for herself. After my grandfather passed away 20 years earlier, she invested wisely, sold farmland at exactly the right time, and accumulated considerable assets. Several $1 million worth. More importantly, she controlled a charitable foundation that funded scholarships and community programs throughout our county. Everyone in the family knew about it. Everyone assumed they knew what would happen when she eventually passed away. Apparently they were wrong. What does this have to do with me? Another pause. Mrs. Rose Mitchell specifically requested your involvement. That got my attention. My involvement? How? She named you successor trustee. I blinked. What? You are now designated as primary successor trustee of her estate. For a moment I thought I'd misunderstood him. That role carried enormous responsibility. Financial oversight, asset management, distribution authority. It wasn't something people handed out casually, especially not in families where multiple children and grandchildren existed. My grandmother did this 2 days ago. Yes, and she's healthy. Quite healthy. Then why? Mr. Harlan hesitated. Professional lawyers are careful people. They don't like discussing family disputes. Finally, he chose his words carefully. Your grandmother was deeply disturbed by events she witnessed on Christmas Eve. The room suddenly felt very quiet. David and I exchanged glances. So Grandma knew. Of course she knew. She'd probably heard about it before dinner ended. Small-town Ohio families aren't exactly famous for keeping secrets. What exactly changed? I asked. That is something your grandmother would prefer to discuss personally. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat motionless for almost a minute. My phone continued vibrating. Call after call, message after message. The panic on the other end was obvious. David folded his arms. So, you think this is about your father? I laughed bitterly. When isn't it? By late afternoon, another voicemail arrived. This one was from Aunt Carol. I almost deleted it. Then curiosity won. Sarah, please call us. Nobody knew Grandma would react like this. I froze. React like what? A second voicemail followed. This time from my cousin Jim. Look, people are upset. Grandma's serious. You need to call. Serious. That word appeared repeatedly. Serious. Very serious. Extremely serious. Whatever had happened after Christmas dinner had shaken the entire family. And somehow I was sitting in the center of it without knowing why. That evening I finally called Grandma directly. She answered on the second ring. Hello, sweetheart. Her voice sounded perfectly normal. Strong. Calm. Exactly like always. Grandma. Merry Christmas. The simple greeting nearly made me laugh. Merry Christmas. I suppose everyone's been calling. Constantly. Good. I wasn't expecting that answer. Good. Let them squirm. I leaned back in my chair. For 86 years old, Grandma Rose still knew how to surprise people. Grandma, what happened? What happened is your father embarrassed himself. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty. Just facts. He embarrassed the family. I remained quiet. She continued. You drove 14 hours to be there. Yes. You brought your husband. Yes. You brought your daughter. I smiled slightly. Grandma always called Emily my daughter. Never stepdaughter. Never anything else. My daughter, I agreed. And your father turned them away. That's what happened. She made a sound of disgust. I raised him better than that. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then she said something that surprised me even more. Sarah, do you know what I remember most about that day? No. The look on Emily's face. My throat tightened. Apparently I wasn't the only one who had noticed. Grandma continued quietly. That child looked heartbroken. She was. I know. Another pause. Then, that's when I decided. I knew immediately what she meant. The estate. I closed my eyes. Grandma, you didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. No. Yes. Her voice became firmer. I watched that family spend years taking your loyalty for granted. I didn't answer, because she wasn't wrong. She knew things most people didn't. She knew about the financial help I'd quietly provided over the years, the mortgage payment I'd made when my parents struggled after Dad's surgery, the tuition assistance for a cousin, the emergency loan to an uncle. I never talked about those things. Neither did she. But she knew. She always knew. Family isn't blood, Sarah. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Family is who shows up. I felt tears threatening again. Grandma kept going. When your father needed help, you showed up. When your mother needed help, you showed up. When Michael needed help, you showed up. Her voice softened. When Emily needed a mother, you showed up. I couldn't speak. For years I had wanted someone in my family to understand. Someone to see things clearly. Apparently, Grandma had been watching the entire time. "I didn't make these changes to punish anyone," she said. "I made them because responsibility belongs with the person who understands what family actually means." The words stayed with me long after we ended the call. That night I finally listened to my father's voicemail. His voice sounded different. Smaller somehow. Less confident. "Sarah, call me." No lecture. No excuses. No demands. Just those 2 words. Call me. For the first time in my life, my father sounded afraid. And I was beginning to understand why. The next morning, a certified letter arrived by overnight delivery. It came from Richard Harlan's office. Inside was an invitation. Grandma wanted a family meeting. Everyone. No exceptions. The meeting would take place in Ohio in 3 days. Attendance strongly recommended. I read the letter twice, then looked up at David. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I stared out the window. Toward the falling snow. Toward the long road back to Ohio. Toward the family that suddenly couldn't stop calling. Finally, I folded the letter. "I'm going." The drive back to Ohio felt completely different from the first one. 4 days earlier, we'd been carrying wrapped presents and Christmas expectations. Now we were carrying questions. A lot of questions. Nobody knew exactly what Grandma had changed. Nobody knew how extensive the legal revisions were. But judging from the non-stop phone calls, the entire family believed something important had happened. Very important. The closer we got to Ohio, the more messages appeared. My father had stopped calling every hour. Now he called every few hours. That alone told me something. Tom Mitchell was not a patient man. If he was suddenly exercising restraint, it meant someone had advised him to. Probably my mother. Or possibly an attorney. Either way, it wasn't normal. We arrived at Grandma Rose's house shortly before noon. Her home sat on 15 acres outside town. A beautiful white farmhouse surrounded by old maple trees. The place had been the center of our family for decades. Birthday parties, graduations, Thanksgiving dinners. Every major memory seemed connected to that property. Cars already filled the driveway. My parents were there. Michael was there. Several aunts, uncles, and cousins were there. Everyone looked nervous. I noticed something else too. Nobody looked angry. That surprised me. Families facing inheritance disputes usually arrive ready for battle. Instead, people looked worried, almost scared. As soon as I stepped out of the car, conversations stopped. Heads turned. For one uncomfortable moment, every eye focused on me. I hated that. I wasn't interested in being the center of attention. David squeezed my shoulder. "You okay?" "Not really." "Me neither." Emily stood beside us quietly. I noticed several relatives smiling at her. A few even waved. The sudden friendliness wasn't lost on me. Apparently being rude to a 14-year-old had become unpopular. Good. They should feel uncomfortable. Inside the house, Grandma sat in her favorite chair near the fireplace. At 86, she still projected authority. Not through volume. Not through intimidation. Just certainty. When Grandma Rose spoke, people listened. Always had. She smiled when she saw us. "There's my family." Then she stood up and hugged Emily first. Not me. Not David. Emily. I saw several people notice. Good. Let them notice. After everyone settled into the living room, Richard Harlan arrived carrying several folders. The atmosphere immediately changed. Lawyers have that effect, especially when estates are involved. Mr. Harlan cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming." Nobody replied. The silence felt heavy. Professional. Serious. Exactly the way legal meetings often feel. He opened a folder. "Mrs. Mitchell recently requested several modifications to her estate plan." My father shifted uncomfortably. Michael crossed his arms. Mom stared at the floor. Mr. Harlan continued. "These changes were made voluntarily and with full legal capacity. Translation: nobody could challenge Grandma's mental competence. The attorney was getting that issue out of the way immediately. Smart man? Among other revisions, he continued, Mrs. Mitchell has appointed a new successor trustee for her estate and charitable foundation. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Everyone already knew what was coming. Still hearing it officially mattered. Mr. Harlan looked down at the document. Sarah Mitchell. The room remained silent. Not shocked. Just resigned. Apparently word had already spread. My father closed his eyes briefly. Michael stared straight ahead. Mom looked like she might cry. I felt strangely uncomfortable. Not triumphant. Not victorious. Just uncomfortable. Because I never asked for this. Never expected it. Never wanted family power. I wanted family love. Unfortunately, those aren't the same thing. Mr. Harlan continued explaining the responsibilities. Trust administration. Asset oversight. Foundation management. Scholarship approval authority. several legal safeguards, several financial obligations. The role was substantial. Far more substantial than I had imagined. Then Grandma interrupted. Richard. Yes. Tell them why. The attorney hesitated. Clearly he preferred staying out of family emotions. But Grandma wasn't asking. She was instructing. Finally he nodded. Mrs. Mitchell specifically requested that her reasoning be included in today's discussion. He opened another document. Then he began reading. I have spent many years observing the people in my family. The room became completely silent. Some share my blood, some do not. I saw Emily listening carefully. I have learned that character matters more than biology. Nobody moved. Nobody even coughed. The person I trust most is the person who consistently serves others without demanding recognition. My stomach tightened. I knew where this was heading. The person who has demonstrated integrity, responsibility, and compassion is my granddaughter, Sarah. I looked down. Suddenly the floor seemed very interesting. Most importantly, she understands that family is defined by commitment, not genetics. The statement ended. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the only sound came from the fireplace. Crackling logs. Burning wood. Then Michael stood up. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just frustrated. Mom. He looked at Grandma. This is because of Christmas. Grandma didn't blink. Partly. Michael shook his head. One argument changes everything. No. Her voice remained calm. One argument revealed everything. The distinction landed heavily. Because she was right. Christmas hadn't created the problem. It had exposed it. Years of behavior compressed into a single moment. One doorway. One sentence. One choice. Blood family only. Michael looked toward our father. Dad looked away. For the first time in my entire life, I saw genuine embarrassment on his face. Not irritation. Not stubbornness. Embarrassment. Grandma turned toward him. Thomas. He slowly looked up. What exactly did you think would happen? Dad swallowed. Nobody rescued him. Nobody changed the subject. Nobody softened the conversation. For once, he had nowhere to hide. I made a mistake, Grandma nodded. Yes, the single word hit harder than a lecture. I know. Another pause. Then Dad surprised everyone, including me. I didn't think she'd leave. The room went silent again. I stared at him. Of all the explanations I had imagined, that wasn't one of them. Grandma stared too. What? Dad shifted awkwardly. I thought she'd argue. He looked genuinely confused, almost bewildered. I thought she'd push back. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After 42 years, my father still didn't understand. He thought the problem was that I left. Not that he had excluded my family. Grandma apparently reached the same conclusion, because her expression hardened. Thomas, she shouldn't have had to argue. Nobody spoke. Dad lowered his eyes. For perhaps the first time in his life, he seemed to understand how badly he'd misjudged the situation. And judging from the faces around the room, he wasn't the only one. Nobody left after the meeting. That surprised me. Families usually scatter once lawyers finish talking, especially when inheritance is involved. Instead, people lingered. Some gathered in the kitchen. Others stood near the fireplace. Small conversations broke out throughout the house. The atmosphere felt strange. Not hostile. Not friendly. More like everyone was quietly reevaluating things they had ignored for years. I stepped onto the back porch for some air. The Ohio winter had settled in completely. Snow covered the fields behind Grandma's house. The old red barn stood in the distance exactly as it had when I was a child. Some things changed. Some didn't. The screen door opened behind me. I didn't need to turn around. I already knew who it was. My father. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he joined me at the railing. His hands were shoved into his coat pockets. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. The confident certainty that usually surrounded him seemed thinner somehow. Finally, he cleared his throat. I never expected any of this. I stared at the snowy field. Neither did I. Another silence. Then, your grandmother thinks I'm a terrible person. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it sounded so much like him. Even now he was focused on how the situation affected him. I don't think that's what she thinks. He looked at me. Then what does she think? I turned toward him. For the first time all day, I answered honestly. I think she believes you hurt people without realizing it. The words hung between us. Dad looked away first. That told me more than any argument could have. When I was younger, conversations like this always ended the same way. He'd become defensive. I'd become frustrated. Mom would intervene. Nothing would change. But today felt different. Maybe because too many people had witnessed what happened. Maybe because Grandma had forced everyone into the open. Or maybe because age eventually catches up with all of us, even stubborn people. I didn't mean to hurt Emily. I studied him carefully. The surprising thing was that I believed him. Not because he was innocent, because he genuinely hadn't considered her feelings. To my father, she had been an abstract idea, a technicality, a stepchild. Not a 14-year-old girl standing 3 feet away. Not a human being. That was the problem. Did you think she wouldn't hear you? He winced. No. Did you think she wouldn't understand? No. Then what exactly did you think would happen? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because there wasn't a good answer. There never had been. The screen door opened again. This time it was Michael. My younger brother looked irritated. Not angry. Irritated. Like a man forced into a conversation he'd rather avoid. Grandma wants everyone inside. Dad nodded. Michael stayed where he was. Then he looked at me. You know, people think this is revenge. There it was. The thing everyone had been thinking but avoiding. I crossed my arms. What people? Family. I laughed softly. Family. The word carried more weight than usual. Michael noticed. His expression tightened. I mean it. I know. You're in charge now. No. He frowned. What? I'm responsible now, that's different. Michael didn't seem convinced. For most of our lives, he had measured success through control. Who got attention? Who got opportunities? Who had influence? Responsibility wasn't something he valued. Power was. Unfortunately, those aren't the same thing either. Grandma gave you everything. I shook my head. No, she didn't. Pretty close. That was when I finally became annoyed. Michael, do you know how much work this is? He blinked. I continued. Do you know how many hours trustees spend dealing with lawyers, accountants, taxes, audits, compliance reviews, and investment reports? Silence. Do you know how much personal liability comes with fiduciary responsibility? More silence. I didn't inherit a prize. His expression changed slightly. Not agreement, understanding. There was a difference. For the first time, he realized this wasn't some movie-style victory. This was work. Serious work. Work Grandma trusted me to do, because she believed I'd actually do it. Inside the house, lunch had been arranged buffet style. People moved through the dining room quietly. The mood remained thoughtful. Aunt Carol eventually approached me. Can we talk? Sure. She looked uncomfortable. I owe you an apology. That caught me off guard. For what? For Christmas. I shrugged. You weren't at the door. No. She looked down. But I was inside. The distinction mattered. A lot. Because that's how family failures usually happen. Not through active cruelty. Through passive silence. I should have said something. I nodded. Maybe? She sighed. I wanted to. That answer felt painfully honest. Many people want to do the right thing. Fewer actually do it. We talked for several minutes. Then another cousin approached. Then an uncle. Then someone else. One conversation after another. A pattern slowly emerged. People had noticed things for years. The favoritism, the dismissive comments, the different standards. Many simply chose not to get involved. Because confronting family is uncomfortable. Because challenging old dynamics creates conflict. Because silence feels easier, until it isn't. Later that afternoon, Grandma asked me to join her in the study. The moment we were alone, she smiled. You're handling this well. I'm trying. You expected something different. I laughed. A little. She nodded knowingly. Revenge isn't nearly as satisfying as people imagine. That statement stayed with me. Because if anyone had earned the right to be bitter, it was probably me. Yet standing there I wasn't. Hurt. Absolutely. Disappointed. Of course. But revenge? Not really. What I wanted wasn't punishment. What I wanted was understanding. Grandma settled into a chair. Then she said something I hadn't expected. Do you know why I chose you? Because of Christmas. She shook her head. No. I frowned. Then why? Because Christmas revealed what I already knew. I sat quietly. She continued. For years I watched people come to you when they needed help. I remembered those moments. The emergency phone calls. The financial requests. The favors. The crises. You always showed up. I smiled faintly. Usually. No. Her eyes met mine. Always. The certainty in her voice caught me off guard. Then she added, even for people who didn't deserve it. That one hurt. Because it was true. More true than I wanted to admit. Grandma reached over and squeezed my hand. The real test isn't how people behave when they have power. I listened carefully. It's how they behave when they finally get it. Outside the study window, snow continued falling. Inside, I realized everyone was waiting to see what I would do next. Including my father. Including Michael. Including Grandma. And maybe even including myself. The next morning, I woke up before everyone else. Old Navy habits die hard. The farmhouse was quiet. Outside, fresh snow covered the fields. Inside, the coffee maker hummed softly in the kitchen. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt calm. Not happy. Not victorious. Just calm. The previous day's meeting had changed something. The truth was finally out in the open. Nobody could pretend anymore. Nobody could claim they didn't know. The family had seen exactly what happened. More importantly, they had seen why Grandma responded the way she did. Now the question wasn't what my father had done. The question was what I would do. By 8 o'clock, people started gathering in the kitchen. My mother was one of the first. She looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much. Neither had I. She poured herself coffee and sat across from me. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed. I should have stopped him. There it was. The sentence I had waited years to hear. Not because it fixed anything, because it acknowledged reality. I looked at her carefully. I know. Tears immediately filled her eyes. He wasn't right. No. I knew he wasn't right. I nodded. Then why didn't you say anything? The question wasn't angry. It was honest. Mom stared into her coffee cup. The answer took a long time to come. Because I've spent 45 years trying to keep peace in this family. I understood exactly what she meant. Women of my mother's generation often carried that burden. Keep the peace. Avoid conflict. Smooth things over. Sacrifice personal truth for family harmony. The problem was that peace built on silence isn't really peace. It's surrender. Mom finally looked up. And somewhere along the way I forgot that protecting people isn't the same thing as protecting relationships. That might have been the wisest thing she had ever said. Later that morning, Grandma asked everyone to gather again. This meeting was different. No lawyers, no documents, no legal discussions, just family. We sat around the living room. The same room where Christmas celebrations had happened for decades. The same room where countless memories had been made. Grandma looked at all of us. Then she smiled. I think everyone is waiting for Sarah to do something. Several people looked uncomfortable. Because she was right. They were. Grandma turned toward me. What are you going to do? The question hung in the room. My father watched carefully. Michael watched carefully. Everyone watched carefully. I took a slow breath, then answered. I'm going to do exactly what you asked me to do. Grandma nodded, which is, manage the trust responsibly. A few people exchanged glances. I continued, I'm going to protect the foundation. Another nod from Grandma. And, I'm going to treat everyone fairly. Silence. Complete silence. Then Michael frowned. What does that mean? I looked directly at him. It means nobody is getting punished. That surprised everyone, including Michael, including my father, including my mother. I could see it on their faces. They had expected consequences, maybe not publicly, but privately. They expected me to remember every slight, every insult, every disappointment. They expected revenge. Instead, I shook my head. I don't want revenge. My father stared at me. I continued. I spent too many years wanting approval. The room remained silent. Then I spent too many years pretending rejection didn't matter. Nobody interrupted. And now I'm too old to waste energy being bitter. Grandma smiled. A small smile, but a proud one. Michael leaned back in his chair. You really mean that? I do. He studied me for a moment, then slowly nodded. For perhaps the first time in our adult lives, we understood each other a little better. That afternoon, people began heading home. One by one. Cars disappeared down the snowy driveway. The crowd grew smaller. The tension eased. Eventually, only a handful of us remained. Grandma, my parents, David, Emily, and me. We shared dinner together. Nothing fancy. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, dinner rolls. The kind of meal that appears on millions of American tables every year. Simple, comforting, familiar. At one point, Emily laughed at something David said. The sound filled the room. Grandma smiled immediately. My mother smiled too. Then I noticed something unexpected. My father was smiling, not politely, genuinely, watching Emily, listening to her, seeing her, maybe for the first time. Later that evening after dinner, Emily excused herself to help clear dishes. My father stood up too. "I'll help." Everyone froze. Not visibly, but enough to notice. Because nobody could remember the last time Tom Mitchell voluntarily helped in the kitchen, including Tom Mitchell. A few minutes later, I walked in and found him standing beside Emily at the sink. The conversation was awkward. Painfully awkward. But it was happening. And that mattered. As I turned to leave, I heard him quietly say, "I'm sorry." Emily looked surprised. "So am I." He swallowed. "No." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry." I stopped walking. Neither of them noticed. Emily stared at him for several seconds, then nodded. "Okay." Just one word. "Okay." Children can be remarkably generous, sometimes more generous than adults deserve. That night, Grandma sat beside me in the living room. Everyone else had gone upstairs. The fire crackled softly. Outside, snow continued falling. "You passed?" I laughed. "Passed what?" "The test." I smiled. "There was a test." "Of course." She sounded amused. "What was the right answer?" Grandma squeezed my hand. "The same answer you've always given." I waited. "Grace." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she added something I'll never forget. "Anyone can use power to hurt people." I nodded. "Very few people use power to heal them." The words settled deep inside me. Because she was right. The easiest thing in the world would have been retaliation. The hardest thing was choosing something better. And for the first time in my life, I realized my father understood that too. Spring arrived 3 months later. The snow disappeared. The fields around Grandma's farmhouse turned green again. Life settled into a new routine, at least for a while. I returned to Virginia. David returned to teaching. Emily returned to school. The trust administration work turned out to be exactly as complicated as I had predicted. Lawyers, accountants, investment reports, board meetings, compliance reviews. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting, but it mattered. Every scholarship awarded through Grandma's foundation represented a student receiving an opportunity. Every responsible decision protected something she had spent decades building. I took the responsibility seriously, because Grandma had trusted me, and because trust is one of the few things in life that cannot be replaced once it's broken. The surprising part wasn't the work. The surprising part was my relationship with my family. Slowly things began to change. Not overnight. Not dramatically. Real reconciliation rarely works that way. Instead, it happened through small moments, phone calls, conversations, simple efforts, the kind of things people often overlook. My mother called regularly, not because she needed something, just to talk. Sometimes we'd discuss recipes, sometimes gardening, sometimes absolutely nothing important. The conversations felt different, more honest, less careful. For the first time in years, neither of us seemed interested in pretending. Michael changed too. That one surprised me the most. My brother and I would probably never become best friends. We were simply too different. But we stopped competing, stopped measuring, stopped comparing. Middle age has a way of teaching people what actually matters. And what doesn't. Then there was my father. The hardest relationship. The most important one. For several weeks after Christmas, our conversations remained awkward. Polite. Cautious. Careful. Neither of us quite knew how to rebuild 40 years of misunderstanding. Then one Saturday afternoon he called unexpectedly. "Are you busy?" I smiled. That was always how he started difficult conversations. Not particularly. A long pause followed. Then, "How's Emily doing?" I nearly dropped the phone. Not because the question was extraordinary, because it was. For the first time in his life, my father had called specifically to ask about her. Not me. Not the trust. Not the foundation. Emily. "She's doing well." "Good." Another pause. Then, "Tell her I asked." A small thing. A very small thing. But meaningful. Relationships are repaired the same way they are broken. One moment at a time. One choice at a time. One conversation at a time. Summer arrived. Then early autumn. Grandma remained surprisingly healthy. She attended foundation events, visited friends, played cards, read books, complained about politicians. In other words, she remained exactly herself. One October afternoon, she invited me to lunch. Just the two of us. We sat at a small diner near town. The same diner where generations of local families had eaten pie and drank coffee. Halfway through lunch, she looked at me and smiled. "You know you're still angry." I laughed. "Trust Grandma to notice. Maybe a little." "A little." I nodded. "Sometimes." She stirred her coffee. That's normal. I know. What matters is what you do with it. That was classic Grandma. Simple words, complicated truth. I thought about that conversation often afterward. Because forgiveness isn't forgetting. It isn't pretending something never happened. It's choosing not to let the hurt control the rest of your life. A few months later, shortly after Thanksgiving, Grandma passed away peacefully in her sleep. 87 years old. No suffering. No long hospital stay. Just a quiet ending to a remarkable life. The funeral was held in the same church where she had worshipped for decades. People filled every pew. Family, friends, former scholarship recipients, neighbors, community leaders. The turnout said everything. A life measured not by wealth, but by impact. After the service, people gathered in the fellowship hall. Stories filled the room. Laughter mixed with tears. Memories passed from one generation to the next. Then something happened that I never expected. My father stood up, tapped a spoon against a glass, and asked for everyone's attention. The room slowly became quiet. Dad looked nervous, more nervous than I had ever seen him. His eyes found mine, then David's, then Emily's. He took a deep breath. I need to say something. Nobody interrupted. For several seconds he struggled to continue. Then the words finally came. I spent a lot of years believing family was about blood. The room remained silent. I was wrong. I felt my throat tighten immediately. Dad looked toward David. You've been a better son than I deserved. David looked stunned. Then Dad turned toward Emily. The room seemed to hold its breath. And you've always been my granddaughter. Tears instantly filled her eyes. Mine too. Dad swallowed hard. The fact that it took me so long to understand that is something I'll regret for the rest of my life. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then he looked directly at me. His voice shook. I'm sorry, Sarah. Years of disappointment. Years of hurt. Years of waiting. All contained in 2 words. I'm sorry. Not an excuse. Not a justification. Not a defense. An apology. A real one. I stood up, walked across the room, and hugged him. The room disappeared. The years disappeared. The anger disappeared. Not completely. Maybe not forever, but enough. Enough to move forward. Enough to begin again. That Christmas, exactly 1 year after everything happened, we gathered at my parents' house. The same doorway, the same family. But something had changed. Before dinner, my father walked over to the fireplace. Several Christmas stockings hung there. One for Mom, one for Dad, one for Michael, one for me. Then he picked up another stocking, a new one, red with white trim. He hung it carefully beside the others. The name stitched across the front read, Emily. My daughter smiled. My father smiled back. And in that moment, I think Grandma would have been proud. If you've listened this far, maybe this story reminds you of someone. Maybe a parent. Maybe a child. Maybe a wound that never completely healed. Families are complicated. People make mistakes, sometimes very painful ones. But whenever possible, choose honesty over silence. Choose courage over comfort. And choose love over pride. Because blood may create relatives, but character creates family. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like more stories about family forgiveness, resilience, and second chances, you're always welcome to come back and listen again. Couldn't afford a lawyer. My father's voice carried across the courtroom loud enough for everyone to hear. A few people sitting behind him chuckled under their breath. I kept walking. The heels of my navy dress shoes clicked softly against the old tile floor inside the Norfolk County Probate Court. I held a worn leather folder tightly against my chest and took my seat alone at the defense table. Dad leaned back in his chair wearing the same smug expression I'd seen my whole life whenever he thought he had the upper hand. My mother crossed her arms beside him and smiled thinly. "This'll be quick," she whispered. I don't think she meant for me to hear it, but I did. Their attorney, a heavyset man named Richard Bellamy, adjusted his expensive tie and glanced at me with open pity, or maybe contempt. Hard to tell sometimes. Judge Harold Bennett entered the courtroom a moment later and everyone rose. I stood straight automatically. 20 years in the Navy trains certain habits into your bones. The judge sat down, adjusted his glasses, and began reviewing the probate file involving my grandmother Linda Carter's estate. Outside the tall courthouse windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. The whole room smelled faintly like old paper and wet coats. Mr. Bellamy stood first. "Your Honor, this is a very simple matter involving property transfer and estate clarification." Then the courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. An older woman with silver hair stepped inside carrying a sealed manila envelope. The judge immediately recognized her. "So good to see you again, Ms. Holloway," he said carefully. Richard Bellamy's confidence vanished instantly. Margaret Holloway walked toward the bench with slow, steady steps that somehow made the entire room quieter. I saw my father frown. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered. Margaret handed the envelope to the judge. "Direct instructions from Linda Carter," she said calmly. "To be opened only if her granddaughter appeared in court without representation." The judge broke the seal. He read the first page silently. Then he stopped. Actually stopped breathing for a second. Mr. Bellamy frowned uneasily. "Your Honor." The judge handed him the document. Bellamy's face drained of color so fast it honestly frightened me. "Oh my God," he whispered. My father leaned forward. "What?" Bellamy stared at the signature at the bottom of the page like he'd seen a ghost. "Oh my God, look at that signature." Dad's knees buckled against the wooden chair. "Linda?" And that was the moment my family realized Grandma hadn't left this world nearly as helpless as they believed. 3 weeks earlier, I stood alone in a cemetery outside Raleigh, North Carolina, while cold February wind blew through rows of gray headstones. My grandmother had always hated dramatic funerals. "Waste of money," she used to say. So the service was small, quiet, simple, just the way she wanted. I wore my Navy dress whites because I'd flown in directly from Norfolk Naval Station after my leave request was finally approved. My parents didn't hug me when I arrived. Dad barely even looked at me. He just nodded toward my uniform. "You still doing all that Navy stuff?" All that Navy stuff. 20 years of service reduced to a sentence. I should have been used to it by then. But somehow it still hurt. Inside the church fellowship hall after the burial, people gathered around folding tables, eating casseroles and banana pudding, while soft country gospel music played from an old speaker near the kitchen. My mother spent most of the afternoon discussing Grandma's property. Not grieving. Not remembering. Just discussing assets. "The taxes alone are going to be a nightmare," she complained while stirring sweet tea. Dad nodded. "We'll probably sell the farmhouse fast as possible." I looked up sharply. Dad gave me a confused look like I'd spoken out of turn. "Well, obviously." I stared at him for several seconds. Grandma Linda's farmhouse sat on 12 acres outside town. It wasn't some giant fortune, but the place mattered to her. That porch, those gardens, the old oak tree out front where she used to sit every evening reading mystery novels while drinking coffee. That house held her whole life. "You already decided to sell it?" I asked quietly. Mom sighed dramatically. "Emily, honey, these things are complicated. You live in Virginia. You're never here." "Never here." I heard that phrase most of my adult life. Never here for birthdays. Never here for Christmas. Never here when Dad had surgery. Never here when the roof leaked. As if military service was some selfish vacation I'd chosen to avoid them. My older brother Mark avoided eye contact completely while shoving deviled eggs onto a paper plate. That was Mark's specialty. Avoiding things. Especially conflict. Especially when our parents were wrong. Dad lowered his voice. "Besides, your grandmother depended on us those last few years." I nearly laughed. Depended on them. I was the one calling her every Sunday from whatever base or deployment zone I happened to be stationed in. I was the one paying for the new water heater 2 winters ago after Grandma quietly admitted she couldn't afford it. I was the one she trusted enough to tell the truth, and the truth was simple. My parents visited Linda when it benefited them. I visited because I loved her. That night after everyone left, I drove alone to the small roadside motel outside town where I always stayed during visits home. The same faded sign buzzed outside. The same floral bedspread. The same smell of old carpet and cigarette smoke buried deep in the walls despite years of no-smoking policies. I sat on the edge of the bed still wearing part of my uniform. That's when I opened Grandma's final letter. Her handwriting shook more than it used to, but it was still unmistakably hers. "Emily, if you're reading this, I'm probably somewhere arguing with St. Peter about his coffee. Now listen carefully. You were never hard to love. Don't let anybody rewrite your life and convince you otherwise." I had to stop reading for a minute after that, because no one had ever said those words to me before. Not once. Not in 38 years. Outside rain tapped softly against the motel window. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes. Suddenly I was 19 again. Standing in our kitchen with Navy recruitment papers in my hand while Dad shouted that military women ended up lonely and bitter. Mom cried because she thought I'd never get married. Mark sat there silently eating mashed potatoes. Only Grandma Linda smiled. She drove me to the recruiter's office herself the next morning in her old Buick. You go see the world, she told me. What if I fail, I asked. She squeezed my hand. Then fail bravely. I still remembered those words 20 years later. The next morning after the funeral, Dad called me before sunrise. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to talk about Grandma. He called about court. Apparently, Linda's estate documents had complications. And somehow those complications were serious enough to involve probate litigation. You probably ought to get yourself a lawyer, Dad said casually. I looked out the motel window toward the empty highway. Why? There was a pause. Then he answered carefully. Well, because your grandmother left some confusing paperwork. That was the first moment I realized something bigger was happening beneath the surface. And somehow, Grandma had known it was coming. I didn't sleep much after my father's phone call. The rain continued most of the night, tapping softly against the motel window, while 18-wheelers rumbled down the highway outside. Around 3 a.m, I finally gave up pretending to sleep and walked to the small coffee machine near the motel office. The coffee tasted burnt enough to strip paint. Grandma would have laughed at that. Bad coffee builds character, she always said. I sat alone in the dim lobby, holding the paper cup with both hands while trying to make sense of everything. Probate litigation. Confusing paperwork. Get yourself a lawyer. None of it sounded right. Grandma Linda had been organized her entire life. The woman labeled extension cords in her garage. She kept appliance warranties from the 1980s in neat folders. There was no universe where she accidentally created legal confusion, which meant one thing: whatever was happening was intentional. The next afternoon I drove out to Linda's farmhouse. The gravel road looked smaller than I remembered. Winter had stripped most of the trees bare, and the old white farmhouse sat beneath gray Carolina skies like something quietly waiting to be forgotten. Dad's truck already sat parked outside. So did Mom's SUV. I stayed in my car for a moment, watching them through the windshield. My father stood near the barn talking with a realtor. Already. Grandma had been buried less than 24 hours earlier. Something inside me hardened a little then. Not anger exactly. Just clarity. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch. Dad looked annoyed the second he saw me. What are you doing here? I stared at him. It's Grandma's house. He crossed his arms. Not for long. The realtor awkwardly pretended to examine the property line, while my mother emerged from the front door carrying a cardboard box filled with Linda's things. Family photographs, cookbooks, old letters. My chest tightened immediately. Mom, I said carefully, what are you doing? Cleaning. She just died. Mom sighed dramatically like I was being difficult on purpose. Emily, this isn't a movie. Real life keeps moving. Real life. Another phrase people use when they want permission to behave badly. I walked past them into the house. The smell hit me first. Coffee. Lavender. Old wood. Grandma. Everything looked exactly the same. Her knitted blanket still draped across the couch. Reading glasses sat beside the recliner near the lamp. A half-finished crossword puzzle rested on the kitchen table. For one impossible second, it felt like she might walk in from the garden any minute asking whether I wanted pie. Then reality settled back in, and the silence hurt worse than I expected. I slowly walked toward the hallway when my father's voice followed behind me. Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly near the end. I turned around. What's that supposed to mean? Dad rubbed his jaw. She got confused sometimes. That was a lie. And we both knew it. Linda Carter was sharper at 82 than most people were at 50. 3 months earlier, she'd beaten me at poker while explaining why the Navy overpaid defense contractors. Confused people don't do that. Mom placed the cardboard box on the table. There were papers everywhere, she added carefully. Legal papers, notes, financial stuff. What kind of papers? Dad answered too quickly. Nothing important. That's when I knew. They were hiding something. That evening after they finally left, I stayed alone at the farmhouse. The quiet there felt different from the quiet inside my apartment back in Norfolk. This quiet had memory inside it. I wandered slowly through each room, touching familiar things. The hallway wall still displayed my Navy graduation photo from Great Lakes. Not Mark's high school football picture. Not Dad's business award. Mine. Grandma always kept mine in the center. I smiled faintly at that. Then I noticed something strange. One picture frame near the hallway looked crooked. Grandma hated crooked frames. I lifted it carefully. Behind it sat a small sealed envelope taped to the wall. My heart started pounding immediately. Across the front in Linda's shaky handwriting were 5 words. For Emily, if necessary. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table before opening it. Inside was another letter. Short. Direct. Exactly like her. Sweetheart, if your parents challenge my wishes, call Margaret Holloway immediately. Trust nobody else. The number is attached. And Emily, I know exactly what I'm doing. Love always, Grandma. Attached beneath the note was a business card. Margaret Holloway, Esquire. Washington, D.C. Military Estate and Federal Council. I stared at the card for a long time. Then I laughed softly to myself. Of course. Of course Grandma had planned ahead. I first met Margaret Holloway when I was 23 years old. At the time, I was stationed in Bahrain during one of the hardest years of my Navy career. My marriage had collapsed after endless deployments and distance. My ex-husband finally admitted he was tired of living with the Navy version of me. I remember calling Grandma from overseas one night after signing divorce papers. I cried harder than I intended, not because I lost the marriage, but because I felt like I'd failed at being normal. Failed at being a woman somehow. Grandma listened quietly for nearly an hour. Then she said something I never forgot. Emily, there's nothing wrong with women who survive differently. A week later, care packages started arriving from home. Cookies, coffee, handwritten jokes, new socks, and one legal packet containing financial documents I needed for the divorce. Inside was a note. Margaret helped organize this. She's smarter than most senators. That was Linda. Even her comfort came prepared. The next morning, I finally called the number. A calm older woman answered on the second ring. Margaret Holloway speaking. This is Emily Carter, I said nervously. Linda Carter's granddaughter. Silence. Then her voice softened instantly. Oh, sweetheart. Just those two words nearly broke me. She told me you might call. Margaret continued gently. You knew Grandma. Knew her, honey. Your grandmother saved my career in 1978. That surprised me enough to laugh. What? Margaret chuckled softly. We worked together at a military law office in D.C. long before you were born. Linda was the smartest legal secretary I ever met. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly pieces started connecting. The organized paperwork. The hidden letters. The confidence. She planned this, didn't she? I whispered. Margaret paused carefully. Your grandmother understood people better than they understood themselves. That sounded exactly like Linda. Margaret continued. Emily, your grandmother was deeply concerned before she passed. Concerned about what? Your parents. The room fell silent around me. Outside the farmhouse window, wind moved through the dead winter grass. She believed they intended to pressure the estate process after her death, Margaret explained calmly. So she prepared documentation in advance. I closed my eyes. Even now, even dying, Grandma was still protecting me. Margaret spoke again. Can you come to Norfolk next Thursday? That's the hearing date. I know. There was a long pause. Then Margaret said something that made my stomach tighten. Bring no attorney. What? Trust me. I stared out toward Grandma's garden. Dead roses bent beneath cold February wind. Okay, I whispered finally. Margaret's voice softened again. Your grandmother loved you very much, Emily. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. And for the first time since the funeral, I stopped feeling afraid. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the motel bathroom mirror, buttoning my navy dress uniform with hands that looked steadier than I felt. Outside, Norfolk was wrapped in cold gray rain again. Funny how storms seem to arrive exactly when life turns heavy. I stared at my reflection for a long moment. 38 years old. Commander's pin on my collar. 20 years of service. 2 deployments in the Persian Gulf. A Navy Achievement Medal. A divorce. No children. No real place that ever fully felt like home. And somehow, one probate courtroom still had the power to make me feel 12 years old again. I picked up Grandma Linda's letter from the sink counter and folded it carefully into my inside coat pocket. Then I drove to court alone. The courthouse parking lot was already crowded when I arrived. My parents stood near the entrance beneath a black umbrella while their attorney smoked beside the sidewalk. My older brother Mark lingered nearby with his hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. The second Dad saw me, his mouth tightened. You really came without counsel. I locked my car quietly. That seems to bother you. Dad scoffed. It concerns me. No, it didn't. What concerned him was uncertainty. My father liked situations he could control. Predictable things. Weak people. And today, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't completely sure what I knew. Mom stepped closer, lowering her voice. Emily, there's still time to handle this privately. I looked at her carefully. Privately, Dad answered before she could. Your grandmother was confused near the end. We don't want the court wasting time over paperwork mistakes. There it was again. confused. I felt anger rise in my chest, but I swallowed it down. Grandma deserved better than a screaming match in a courthouse parking lot. So I simply asked, "What exactly are you afraid the judge might see?" Dad's face hardened immediately. "Don't start acting dramatic." Mark still said nothing. He just stared at the wet pavement like a man hoping the earth might open beneath him. We walked inside together in silence. Probate Courtroom B felt too small for the amount of tension sitting inside it. Old wooden pews lined the room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere nearby, a copier machine clicked endlessly through courthouse walls. A few local townspeople sat quietly in the back rows. Small-town gossip travels fast, especially when family money's involved. Richard Bellamy stood confidently at the plaintiff's table, organizing stacks of paperwork. He smiled politely at me, though the expression never reached his eyes. "Commander Carter," he said. "Still no attorney?" "No, sir." His smile widened slightly. "Well, that's certainly your choice." Translation: "You're about to lose badly." I took my seat without answering. Dad leaned toward Mom and whispered something that made her smirk. For a second, I remembered being 16 years old, sitting at our dinner table after telling my parents I wanted to apply for an ROTC scholarship. Dad laughed outright. "A girl from this family joining the military." Mom shook her head sadly. "You're too emotional for that kind of life. Funny thing about people who underestimate you. Eventually they start believing their own version of reality." Judge Bennett entered exactly at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. The hearing began quickly. Bellamy moved first. "Your Honor, this matter concerns the estate of Linda Carter, deceased, specifically several irregular documents discovered shortly before probate transfer." He spoke smoothly, professionally, like a man fully convinced victory was routine. He presented my parents as devoted caregivers, responsible, self-sacrificing. He described me as largely absent from family affairs due to military obligations. That phrase irritated me more than it should have. Absent, as though serving your country erased your place in your own family. Bellamy continued. "The plaintiffs believe Ms. Carter may have exercised undue emotional influence over the deceased during periods of isolation." That finally made me look up sharply. Undue emotional influence? I almost laughed. Grandma Linda was the strongest-minded woman I'd ever known. Nobody manipulated her. Nobody. Judge Bennett adjusted his glasses. "Commander Carter," he said calmly, "do you intend to respond?" Every eye in the courtroom turned toward me. My parents looked almost eager. I stood slowly and said exactly what Margaret instructed me to say. "I was advised to wait, Your Honor." Confusion flickered across Bellamy's face. Dad frowned. The judge looked mildly irritated. "Wait for what?" Before I could answer, the courtroom doors opened. Again. Margaret Holloway entered wearing a dark navy coat and carrying a leather briefcase. Even at her age, she moved with remarkable confidence. The entire atmosphere shifted instantly. Bellamy's posture changed first, then the judge's expression, then everyone else's. Judge Bennett actually stood halfway from his chair. "Ms. Holloway." Margaret nodded politely. "Your Honor." Bellamy looked stunned. "You're representing Commander Carter." Margaret removed a pair of reading glasses calmly. "Number." Bellamy blinked. "No. I'm here representing the documented final directives of Linda Carter." Silence settled across the courtroom. Real silence. The kind that makes people suddenly aware of every tiny sound in the room. Rain against windows. Paper shifting. Someone coughing quietly in the back row. Margaret opened her briefcase and removed a sealed file. "Your Honor," she said, "Linda Carter prepared legal contingencies several years ago in anticipation of precisely this situation." Dad's face lost color immediately. How he whispered. Margaret ignored him. She handed the documents to the judge. Judge Bennett reviewed the first pages silently, then slower, then very slowly. His eyebrows lifted. Richard Bellamy shifted uneasily beside the plaintiff's table. "Your Honor," he asked carefully. The judge handed him the file. Bellamy scanned the documents. I watched the exact moment panic entered his eyes. His face drained completely. "Oh my God," he whispered. Dad leaned forward sharply. "What is it?" Bellamy kept reading. There were notarized property transfers, medical evaluations confirming Linda's mental competency, recorded financial statements, and handwritten testimony documenting repeated pressure attempts made by my parents during Linda's final year. But that wasn't the part that shattered the room. The final page did that. Bellamy stared at the signature at the bottom like he couldn't process what he was seeing. "Oh my God," he repeated quietly. Then he looked directly at my father. You told me Linda Carter handled this paperwork herself. Dad swallowed hard. She did. Bellamy's voice dropped. No, sir. She absolutely did not. Mom gripped the edge of the table. What does that mean? Bellamy turned the final page toward them. At the bottom sat the signature that changed everything. Margaret Holloway, former Federal Military Counsel, former advisor to the Department of the Navy, one of the most respected estate litigators on the East Coast. Dad's knees literally buckled against his chair. Linda, he whispered weakly. And suddenly I understood. Grandma hadn't just prepared paperwork. She had built a shield around me years before she died. Judge Bennett removed his glasses slowly. Based on these filings, he said carefully, the court recognizes full legal transfer authority previously granted to Commander Emily Carter. The room stayed completely still. Then the judge added the sentence that finally broke my parents completely. And furthermore, this court will review evidence suggesting possible coercion attempts against the deceased. Mom burst into tears instantly. Dad turned toward Bellamy in panic. You said this was routine. Bellamy stared at him coldly now. Sir, you failed to disclose critical information. For the first time in my entire life. My father looked afraid of me. Not angry. Not disappointed. Afraid. And honestly, that hurt more than I expected it would. The hearing ended less than 40 minutes later. 40 minutes. That was all it took to unravel years of lies, assumptions, and quiet family manipulation. People always imagine courtroom victories as dramatic celebrations, music swelling, heroes walking confidently into sunlight. Real life doesn't feel like that. Real life feels exhausting. By the time I stepped outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped, but the sky still hung low and gray over downtown Norfolk. Reporters weren't waiting. No applause echoed through the streets. Just cold wind, traffic, and the strange emptiness that comes after emotional shock. Margaret Holloway walked beside me quietly, carrying her leather briefcase. You handled yourself well, she said. I gave a tired laugh. I barely spoke. That's usually wiser in court. We stopped near the courthouse steps. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I looked at her. How long did Grandma plan this? Margaret smiled faintly. Longer than you realize. I shook my head slowly. She knew they'd challenge everything. She hoped they wouldn't, Margaret answered gently. But Linda understood human nature very well. That sounded exactly right. Grandma trusted carefully, loved deeply, and prepared thoroughly. Margaret adjusted her coat against the wind. She worried less about the property, she admitted, and more about what your parents might do to you emotionally once she was gone. That sentence hit harder than the court ruling itself. Because it was true. This was never only about land, or money, or a farmhouse. It was about power. Who mattered? Who didn't? Who spent years being treated like an outsider inside their own family. By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone already contained 6 missed calls. 3 from Mom, 2 from Dad, 1 from Mark. I ignored all of them. Not because I wanted revenge. I simply couldn't handle another conversation yet. Instead, I drove back to Linda's farmhouse. The farther I got from Norfolk, the quieter my thoughts became. Rainwater still clung to the fields along the highway. Bare trees blurred past my windows while old country songs played softly through the radio speakers. At some point during the drive, I realized something strange. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. Deeply sad. Because court had confirmed something I spent most of my life trying not to admit. My parents never truly understood me. Maybe they never wanted to. The farmhouse looked softer in the late afternoon light. I parked beside the porch and sat in the car for several minutes before finally going inside. The house greeted me with silence again. But not empty silence, comfortable silence. Linda's kind of silence. I made coffee automatically using the old machine she'd owned since I was in high school. The thing sounded like a lawnmower every time it brewed. Grandma refused to replace it. Suffering builds appreciation, she used to joke. I carried the mug into the living room and sat in her recliner. That's when the memories started arriving harder than before. Birthdays missed during deployment. Christmas video calls from military bases overseas. Promotions my parents barely acknowledged. The time Dad told neighbors Mark was the one who stayed loyal to the family, as if service members abandoned people by serving elsewhere. I stared at the family photographs lining the shelf. Most included Mark. His baseball trophies, his wedding, his children. Normal milestones. Traditional milestones, the kind my parents understood. Then there was me, always in uniform, always leaving again, always slightly outside the picture even when standing inside it. I closed my eyes. And suddenly I remembered a conversation from years earlier. I had just returned from deployment overseas. Grandma and I sat together on this very porch drinking coffee while summer cicadas screamed through the trees. "You know what your problem is?" she asked me. I smiled. "Only one. You spend your whole life trying to earn love from people who already decided not to understand you." That memory nearly broke me now, because she was right. She had always been right. Around 7 o'clock, headlights appeared outside. I looked through the curtains and saw Mark climbing slowly out of his truck. Of everyone in the family, Mark looked the worst after court. Not angry, not defeated, ashamed. I opened the door before he reached the porch. He shoved his hands awkwardly into his pockets. Hey. Neither of us moved for a second. Then he asked quietly, "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. Mark walked through the farmhouse slowly, like someone entering a church after years away. We sat at the kitchen table where Grandma used to serve pancakes every Sunday morning. For several minutes he said nothing. Finally, he looked at me. I should have said something sooner. I already knew what he meant. But I let him say it anyway. "They treated you differently your whole life." I stared down at my coffee. Mark rubbed both hands over his face. "I knew it, Em." That nickname hurt unexpectedly. He hadn't called me that in years. He swallowed hard. I didn't want to fight with Dad. There it was. The truth. Simple. Ugly. Human. I nodded slowly. "You depended on him." "Yeah. You still do." Mark looked embarrassed. "Probably." Silence settled between us again. Then he laughed bitterly. "You know what's crazy?" "What?" "Grandma always talked about you like you were the brave one." I almost smiled. She exaggerated. "No," Mark said quietly, "she didn't." That hit me harder than I expected. Because Mark had spent most of our lives staying neutral, safe, watching conflict from the sidelines. Hearing him say that now mattered. Later that night, after Mark left, another car pulled into the driveway. This time it was my mother, alone. She stood on the porch, clutching her purse tightly against her chest, while cold wind moved through the dark yard behind her. For a moment she looked older than I'd ever seen her. Tired, too. I opened the door without speaking. Mom stepped inside carefully. "I won't stay long." I nodded toward the kitchen. She sat down slowly at the table but didn't remove her coat. Neither of us knew how to begin. Finally, she whispered, "She always admired you." I looked up. "Grandma." Mom nodded. "She used to talk about you constantly." Something tightened painfully inside my chest. Mom stared down at her hands. "She admired your independence." I waited quietly. Then Mom said the sentence I never expected to hear from her. "You became everything I never had the courage to be." The room went completely still. Outside, wind rattled softly against the farmhouse windows. I stared at my mother while years of resentment, confusion, and sadness shifted uneasily inside me. And for the first time in my life, I realized she might have been afraid too. My mother stayed at the farmhouse less than 20 minutes that night. Long enough to say things neither of us fully knew how to handle. Not long enough to fix 38 years of distance. Before leaving, she paused beside the front door with her hand resting on the knob. "I know your father went too far," she said quietly. I folded my arms. "You went along with it." She nodded once. "No excuses." Honestly, that surprised me more than denial would have. Mom looked around the farmhouse slowly. "She loved this place." "I know. She wanted you here." My throat tightened slightly. Then Mom said something that stayed with me long after she drove away. "You know, when you joined the Navy, your father thought you were rejecting us." I frowned. "I joined because I needed my own life. I know that now. But back then they didn't. Or maybe they couldn't." Some parents confuse independence with abandonment, especially when their children grow into people they no longer control. After she left, I locked the front door and walked quietly through the house, turning off lights one room at a time. The farmhouse creaked softly beneath my footsteps. Every corner held memory. Grandma teaching me how to make biscuits in the kitchen. Grandma showing me constellations from the backyard during humid Carolina summers. Grandma driving me to the recruiter's office while Dad refused to speak to me. She had been the bridge between me and the rest of the family for years, and now she was gone. I sat down at the kitchen table around midnight holding the final sealed letter Margaret had given me after court. "Linda wanted you to read this only after the hearing," she'd said. I stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it. My hands trembled more than I expected. Inside were 4 handwritten pages folded carefully together. The first line alone nearly broke me. "Sweetheart, if you're reading this, then I was right about what would happen." I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, she knew me well enough to understand I'd need a minute before continuing. I kept reading. First things first. The house, the land, and the savings are not your burden. They are not payment for suffering. And they are certainly not rewards for pain. I left them to you because you understand responsibility better than the rest of this family. Tears blurred the page for a moment. I wiped them away carefully. You spent your whole life believing love had to be earned through sacrifice. That was never true. The right people love you because you are you. I leaned back slowly in the chair. Outside wind moved through the trees surrounding the farmhouse. Everything felt very still, very far away. Then I reached the final page. And that was the page that changed me. Emily, do not become hard simply because others were hard to you. Bitterness is a lonely way to grow old. I have seen too much of it already. If this family breaks apart after I'm gone, let it break because of truth, not revenge. You are stronger than anger. Always remember that. I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter. Long enough for the coffee beside me to go cold. Long enough for dawn to begin lightening the windows. And somewhere during those quiet early morning hours, something inside me finally loosened. Not forgiveness exactly, but exhaustion. I was tired of carrying anger everywhere. Tired of proving my worth. Tired of needing my parents to become different people before I allowed myself peace. 3 days later, I met Margaret Holloway for lunch near the waterfront in Norfolk. The restaurant overlooked gray winter water where small boats rocked gently against the docks. Margaret ordered black coffee and tomato soup. Your grandmother loved this place, she said while unfolding her napkin. I smiled faintly. She loved everywhere with decent pie. Margaret laughed softly. That too. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The Navy, travel, old stories about Linda during her years working in military law offices. Apparently my grandmother once embarrassed a Pentagon attorney by correcting his paperwork in front of an entire meeting. That sounded exactly like her. Then Margaret looked at me carefully. What will you do now? I stirred my coffee slowly. I'm not sure yet. You could pursue additional legal action. I know. The coercion evidence alone might have destroyed my parents financially if I pushed harder. Public embarrassment. Civil penalties? Potential fraud investigations. A younger version of me might have wanted that. Or maybe a more wounded version. But sitting there by the harbor listening to gulls outside the restaurant windows, I realized something important. I didn't actually want revenge anymore. Not real revenge. What I wanted was freedom. Freedom from resentment. Freedom from constantly reopening old wounds, hoping they'd heal differently. I looked at Margaret. I think Grandma already won. Margaret smiled softly. Yes, she said, I believe she did. Over the next several weeks, I made decisions my family never expected. I sold a small, undeveloped portion of the land near the highway and used part of the money to establish a scholarship fund for Navy families in eastern North Carolina. Nothing enormous. Just enough to help military kids with tuition or emergency expenses. I named it the Linda Carter Family Resilience Fund. Margaret cried when I told her. Dad called twice, trying to discuss financial fairness. I didn't return the calls. Not out of cruelty. I simply understood something now. Some conversations only reopen damage. I also restored the farmhouse instead of selling it. Slowly. Carefully. I repaired the porch steps. Repainted the kitchen. Planted new roses beside the front walkway where Grandma used to garden every spring. And for the first time in years, I slowed down enough to breathe. Military life teaches you constant movement. Schedules, deadlines, deployment clocks, always preparing for the next thing. But the farmhouse moved differently. Morning coffee on the porch, rain against tin roofing, birds settling into oak trees at dusk. Simple things. Human things. One afternoon while planting tomatoes in the backyard garden, my elderly neighbor Mrs. Donahue leaned across the fence watching me work. You know something, she said. What's that? Your grandmother didn't save you with money. I brushed dirt from my hands. No. Mrs. Donahue smiled gently. She saved you with love. I looked out across the property then. The garden. The porch swing. The old oak tree swaying quietly in warm Carolina wind. And suddenly I understood exactly what Grandma had really left me. Not land. Not inheritance. Not victory. Permission. Permission to stop fighting for love that should have been freely given all along. 1 year later, the farmhouse finally felt alive again. Not polished. Not perfect. Alive. The porch had fresh white paint now. New flower boxes hung beneath the front windows, overflowing with yellow daisies and red geraniums. Wind chimes Grandma once loved swayed gently in the warm Carolina breeze. And for the first time in decades, the house sounded happy, Soft conversation drifted through the backyard while folding chairs filled slowly beneath the old oak tree. A few of my Navy friends had driven down from Norfolk for the memorial gathering. Nothing formal, just food, stories, coffee, and people who loved Linda Carter. I wore jeans and a dark navy jacket instead of dress whites that afternoon. Somehow it felt more honest that way. Less ceremony, more family, real family. The kind you build through loyalty instead of obligation. Mrs. Donahue arrived carrying peach cobbler. Margaret Holloway brought old photographs from her years working with Grandma in Washington. Even Mark showed up early to help arrange tables in the yard. Watching my brother carry folding chairs across the grass, I realized he looked older than the year before. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man finally learning what silence had cost him. "You need anything else?" he asked. I handed him a box of paper plates. "Can you put these near the drinks?" "Yep." A small answer. Simple, but somehow meaningful. That was how healing worked sometimes. Not dramatic speeches. Not movie moments. Just small efforts repeated consistently over time. By late afternoon, golden sunlight filtered softly through the trees while people shared stories about Grandma. Most made us laugh. Apparently, Linda once chased a traveling vacuum salesman off the property with a broom because he insulted her coffee. Margaret nearly cried laughing while telling that story. She told him Margaret wheezed, "Any man who dislikes strong coffee probably can't be trusted around machinery." That sounded exactly like Linda. I looked around the yard watching people smile beneath the fading sunlight. For so many years I believed loneliness was permanent. Something stitched into my life forever. But sitting there listening to laughter around Grandma's farmhouse, I realized loneliness changes when people finally stop pretending around each other. Then I noticed a familiar pickup truck pulling slowly into the driveway. My father's truck. Conversation around the yard softened slightly as Dad stepped out wearing pressed jeans and a pale blue button-down shirt. My mother climbed out beside him quietly. For a second, nobody moved. Not awkward exactly, just uncertain. Dad looked smaller than I remembered. Age had finally reached him during the past year. His shoulders curved more. His hair had gone nearly white. And the confidence he once carried everywhere now seemed fragile somehow. Mom offered a nervous smile. "Hi, Emily." "Hi." Dad looked around the property silently. The restored porch, the garden, the repaired barn. All the things Grandma loved. "You fixed it up nice," he said quietly. "Thank you." An uncomfortable pause followed. Then Mark walked over carrying a tray of iced tea glasses like he was deliberately trying to keep the peace. Smart man. Dad accepted a drink but barely touched it. For the next hour, my parents stayed mostly near the edge of the gathering, speaking politely with neighbors and listening to stories about Grandma. No arguments, no tension, just distance. And honestly, distance felt healthier than pretending everything was magically repaired. As sunset approached, guests slowly began leaving. One by one, cars disappeared down the gravel road while warm evening light settled across the property. Margaret hugged me tightly before climbing into her car. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," she whispered. I nearly cried hearing that. After most people left, I stood alone near Grandma's garden, gathering empty cups when I heard footsteps behind me. Dad. I kept placing cups into a trash bag quietly while he stopped beside the fence. For a while, neither of us spoke. Crickets hummed through the evening air. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "I was hard on you." I continued tying the trash bag slowly. "Yes. No point pretending otherwise anymore." Dad stared out across the property. "You know, when you left for the Navy." He paused. "I thought you were leaving us behind." I looked at him carefully. I was trying to survive. He nodded faintly like he understood that now, or maybe wished he understood sooner. Dad rubbed one hand over his face tiredly. "My father treated me the same way he admitted quietly. Everything was about obedience, respect, control. The honesty surprised me." He gave a weak laugh. I guess somewhere along the line I became him. The evening breeze moved softly through the garden between us. For the first time in my life, my father sounded less like an authority figure, and more like an aging man carrying his own regrets. "I spent too much time trying to control people," he said, "not enough time loving them." That sentence sat heavily in the silence between us. I looked toward the farmhouse porch where Mom stood quietly watching us from a distance. Then back at Dad. Part of me still hurt deeply. Probably always would. Some wounds don't disappear completely. But something Grandma wrote returned to me then. "Let truth end the cycle, not revenge." I finally nodded once. "I know." Dad's eyes grew wet for a second before he looked away quickly. That was as close to an apology as he knew how to give. And strangely, it was enough. Not enough to erase the past. Not enough to rebuild everything. But enough to stop carrying hatred forward into whatever years remained. Later that night, after my parents left, I sat alone on the porch, wrapped in a light blanket, while summer insects sang across the fields. The farmhouse glowed softly behind me. Grandma's wind chimes moved gently overhead. I held her final letter in my lap again. The paper had softened from rereading. Moonlight silvered the edges of the garden, while memories drifted quietly through my mind. Lonely deployments. Courtroom humiliation. Years spent trying to earn approval that never came. But also strength, friendship, service, grace. And one extraordinary grandmother who refused to let bitterness become my inheritance. I looked out toward the dark horizon and smiled softly. Then I raised 2 fingers to my forehead in a quiet Navy salute toward the old oak tree. Toward Linda. Toward peace. And maybe toward myself too. If this story touched your heart even a little, I hope you'll take a moment tonight to reach out to someone you love, before pride or silence steals more time. And if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or emotionally forgotten by your own family, remember this. Your worth was never determined by who failed to see it. Sometimes the people who love us best are the ones who quietly teach us how to love ourselves. Thank you for spending this time with me. The moment the room went quiet, I knew my younger sister's marriage was hanging by a thread. My brother-in-law Trevor still had half a grin on his face, like he thought the whole thing was a joke. Across the Thanksgiving table, his father, a retired Marine colonel with silver hair and hands thick from decades of service, was staring at me like he'd seen a ghost walk through the front door. "Boy," he said slowly. Not loudly, not angrily. Worse. The kind of voice older military men use when they already know someone has crossed a line they can't uncross. Apologize now. You could hear the dishwasher humming in the kitchen. My sister Denise stopped cutting the pecan pie. One of the grandkids dropped a fork onto the hardwood floor. Trevor blinked twice, confused, like he couldn't understand why the temperature in the room had suddenly fallen 20 degrees. 10 seconds earlier, he'd been laughing at me. Laughing hard. "So what, you served coffee on base, right?" I remember the smell of turkey and brown sugar glaze hanging in the air when he said it. Everybody around the table had chuckled politely, the kind of laugh families use when they know something is rude but don't want to make things uncomfortable during the holidays. I'd set my glass down carefully. "Try again." Trevor smirked wider. "Then what did you do in the Navy?" And I answered him the same way I might have commented on the weather. "Top Gun instructor." That was when his father froze. Not because of the movies, not because of the name itself, but because men like Richard Hayes knew exactly what it took to earn that title. And suddenly, after 40 years of being invisible in my own family, everybody at that table was looking at me differently. Funny how fast people can rearrange their opinion of you once they realize you were never weak to begin with. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 62 years old, retired Navy, and until that Thanksgiving dinner in Northern Virginia, most of my family thought I'd spent my military career pushing paperwork behind a desk somewhere. Honestly, I'd let them think it. It was easier that way. The trouble with accomplishments is that people often treat them like ownership. The minute relatives discover you've done something difficult, they rewrite history. Suddenly they supported you all along. Suddenly they always believed in you. But that wasn't how my story went. I drove to Denise's house that Thanksgiving through cold November rain with an overnight bag in the trunk and every intention of keeping my head down for 48 hours. Her subdivision looked like every upper-middle-class neighborhood built outside Washington during the late 90s, brick homes, trimmed lawns, SUVs lined neatly along curbs. The kind of place where people talked about service more than sacrifice. Denise greeted me warmly enough at the front door, though there was always a stiffness between us that neither of us knew how to fix anymore. "Evie," she said, hugging me lightly, "long drive. About 4 hours. You should have flown." I almost smiled at that. After 30 years around military aviation, commercial flying had become the one thing I avoided whenever possible. Inside the house smelled like cinnamon candles and roasted turkey. Football played softly from the living room television, while grandchildren raced through the hallway wearing paper turkey hats they'd made at school. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like visiting a version of America I'd spent my life protecting but never quite belonging to. Trevor stood near the kitchen island holding a beer bottle. Big man. Loud personality. The kind who filled silence because he couldn't tolerate it. "Hey," he called when he saw me. "Denise's mysterious sister finally made it." "Mysterious?" I asked. "Well, sure," he laughed. 30 years in the military and nobody knows what you actually did." I took off my coat slowly. Most people never asked. Richard Hayes was sitting quietly near the fireplace when I walked in. Straight posture despite being well into his 70s. One glance told me everything I needed to know about him, old-school Marine Korea veteran father, probably Vietnam himself. Men like him recognized military habits the way musicians recognize rhythm. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. Respectful. Observant. Not performative. That was the first moment all evening I relaxed. Dinner itself started pleasantly enough. Denise had gone all-out sweet potatoes with marshmallows, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce from an actual recipe instead of a can. The grandchildren argued over whipped cream, while Trevor dominated every conversation within reach. He talked about real estate investments, gas prices, politics, how nobody wants to work anymore. I mostly listened. That's another habit the Navy teaches you. Quiet people hear everything. At some point, the conversation turned toward military service after one of the boys asked whether I'd ever been in a dogfight like Maverick. Trevor laughed before I could answer. "Oh, come on," he said. "Your Aunt Evelyn wasn't flying fighter jets." I shrugged lightly. "Why not?" "Because you're too calm." The table laughed. I did too, a little. Not because it was funny. Because most people think dangerous people look dangerous. Truth is, the deadliest men and women I ever met usually sounded like accountants. Trevor leaned back in his chair. "So what, you served coffee on base, right?" And there it was. Not cruel enough to cause a scene. Just disrespectful enough to establish a pecking order. I saw Denise tense immediately. She knew her husband's mouth could outrun his judgment sometimes. I set my water glass down. "Try again." He grinned. "Then what did you do in the Navy?" I looked directly at him. "Top Gun instructor." Silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that arrives when a room suddenly realizes it misunderstood someone completely. Richard Hayes stopped moving altogether. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied me. Then he asked the question nobody else in the room understood enough to ask. "Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program." I nodded once. His expression changed immediately. Not excitement. Recognition. The grandchildren looked confused while Trevor laughed nervously. "Wait, seriously." Richard never took his eyes off me. "Boy," he said quietly. Trevor turned toward his father. "Apologize now." Trevor blinked. "Dad, I was kidding." "No," Richard replied. "You were disrespecting somebody who earned more respect by breakfast than you've earned in your whole life. You could have carved the tension with a butter knife." Denise stared at me like she was meeting me for the first time. And the strange thing was, maybe she was. Richard Hayes followed me into the kitchen about 20 minutes later, while the rest of the family pretended to watch football in the living room. That's the thing about uncomfortable family moments. Nobody ever addresses them directly at first. Americans my age were raised to smooth things over quietly, even when the floorboards underneath the family were cracking. I stood at the sink rinsing dishes while Denise hovered nearby pretending to organize leftovers. Every few seconds she glanced toward me, then away again. Like she wanted to ask something but didn't know where to begin. Richard stopped beside the counter. "You flew Tomcats?" he asked softly. I nodded once at first. "And later?" "Super Hornets." He let out a low whistle under his breath. Not dramatic. Just honest admiration from one old military soul to another. "You must have caught the tail end of Cold War training." "Barely." He folded his arms. Women weren't exactly welcomed into that pipeline back then. "No," I said, "we weren't." Denise finally turned around. "Wait," she said carefully. "You actually flew combat aircraft?" I dried my hands with a towel before answering. "Yes." The room behind us had gone quieter. Trevor was still in there, but now the television volume had magically dropped low enough for everyone to overhear. Families are funny that way. Suddenly I could feel 40 years of assumptions shifting around inside that house like furniture being rearranged. Denise leaned against the counter. "You never told us any of this." I looked at her for a moment. "You never asked." That landed harder than I intended. Her face softened, immediately hurt, mixing with guilt. And right then I almost regretted saying it. Almost. Because the truth was my family stopped being curious about me a very long time ago. Back when we were girls growing up in Ohio, Denise was sunlight. Blonde hair, easy smile, cheerleader ribbons hanging from her bedroom mirror. Everybody loved Denise because Denise made life simple. I was the difficult one. The quiet one. The girl lying on the garage roof at night memorizing aircraft silhouettes while other girls passed notes about boys. Our father used to shake his head every time I brought home another aviation magazine from the library. "You ought to focus on something practical," he'd tell me. Flying is practical. For a man. Richard pulled a chair out slowly and sat down at the kitchen table. "You mind if I ask what your call sign was?" That got Denise's attention immediately. "Call sign," she repeated. I smiled faintly despite myself. Military families understood what that meant. Civilian families usually thought it was something Hollywood invented. I hesitated. Richard noticed. "If it's classified, forget I asked." "It's not classified," I said quietly, "just old." He waited. I looked down at the dish towel in my hands. Iron Widow. For a second, Richard didn't move. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair and muttered one quiet word under his breath. "Jesus." From the living room came Trevor's voice. "What does that mean?" Richard looked toward him. "It means your Aunt Evelyn trained fighter pilots during some very dangerous years. I still don't get why everybody's acting like she landed on the moon. That did it." Richard stood so fast his chair scraped hard across the tile floor. "Because people died learning those skills," he snapped. The whole house went silent again. Trevor stared at his father in shock. I could tell this wasn't how their family normally operated. Richard probably wasn't a man who raised his voice often. Which meant when he did it mattered. He pointed toward Trevor. "You think military aviation is some kind of joke? You think instructors are glorified babysitters?" Trevor shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, I said I was kidding." "No," Richard replied sharply. "You were mocking somebody because you assumed she was small enough to mock." Denise stepped between them gently. "Okay," she said softly, "everybody calm down." I hated the direction things were going. Not because Trevor didn't deserve embarrassment. Because public humiliation rarely changes people for the better. It just makes them defensive. "I'm not upset," I said. Trevor looked at me suspiciously. "Then why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" That question hung in the kitchen longer than the others had. Why didn't I? The answer wasn't simple. Because when I graduated near the top of flight school, my father said they were lowering standards. Because when I made instructor, one uncle joked I was probably sleeping with admirals. Because when I missed holidays due to deployments, relatives called me selfish for choosing career over family. After enough years, silence becomes easier than self-defense. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from Richard. "You know what happens when people hear words like Top Gun?" I asked quietly. Nobody answered. They stop seeing you as a person. The kitchen clock ticked softly. They either worship you or resent you, sometimes both. Richard nodded slowly. He understood. Trevor still looked unconvinced, but less arrogant now. More uncertain. Like he was trying to recalculate the entire evening in his head. Denise sat beside me carefully. "I honestly thought you worked logistics or administration." "I did some of that too. But why never correct us?" I gave a tired little shrug. Would it have changed anything? Nobody answered because everybody knew the answer. Probably not. The grandchildren wandered halfway into the kitchen, then sensing tension but too young to understand it. Denise's youngest granddaughter looked up at me curiously. "Did you really fly jets?" I smiled at her. "Yes." "Were you scared?" That question made Richard glance toward me again. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Not whether I was important. Not whether I was impressive. Whether I was afraid. All the time I told her honestly. The child frowned. "Then why'd you do it?" I thought about all the funerals. All the folded flags. All the young pilots pretending bravery before missions. And all the instructors like me who carried the burden of preparing them. Because being scared doesn't mean you quit, I said. The little girl considered that seriously before nodding. Children understand courage better than adults sometimes. Trevor stared down at the kitchen floor for a long moment. Then finally he said the words Richard had been waiting for. I'm sorry, Evelyn. Not polished. Not dramatic. But real enough. And strangely, hearing it didn't make me feel victorious. Just tired. Because apologies arrive quickly at 62 for wounds that began at 16. Later that night, after everyone drifted off toward desserts and coffee, Richard found me alone on the back porch, wrapped in Denise's old wool blanket. Cold rain tapped softly against the deck railing. He stood beside me quietly for a while before speaking. You saved lives, didn't you? I kept looking out into the darkness. I trained people, I answered. He nodded slowly. That means yes. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Richard asked the question nobody in my family had ever bothered asking before. What did it cost you? And for the first time all evening, I didn't know how to answer. Richard's question stayed with me long after the porch conversation ended. What did it cost you? Funny thing is, younger people usually ask what you achieved. Older people eventually learn to ask what it took. By midnight, the house had gone quiet except for the refrigerator humming in Denise's kitchen, and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. I couldn't sleep, so I sat alone at the dining room table with a cup of decaf coffee that tasted weak enough to qualify as punishment. The same table where only hours earlier my brother-in-law had laughed at me. Life turns quickly sometimes. I heard footsteps behind me around 1 a.m. Denise appeared wearing a faded University of Virginia sweatshirt and reading glasses she'd probably deny needing during daylight hours. You always stayed up late, she asked softly. Military habit. She poured herself coffee and sat across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. At 60 years old, my sister still tucked loose hair behind her ear the same nervous way she did at 17. You know, she finally said, when we were kids, I used to tell people you'd become a scientist. I smiled faintly. Why scientist? You were always taking radios apart. That drove Dad crazy. That made her laugh quietly. He thought you were going to electrocute yourself. The mention of our father settled heavily between us. He'd been gone nearly 12 years now. Heart attack at 74, sudden, quick, the kind of death people call merciful because they don't know what else to say. I stared down into my coffee. He never forgave me for joining the Navy. Denise looked uncomfortable immediately. He was old-fashioned. No, I said gently, he was disappointed. There's a difference. People from our parents' generation had very fixed ideas about what daughters were supposed to become. Teachers, nurses, secretaries, wives. Safe. Understandable. I was none of those things. Even at 12 years old, I knew ordinary life would suffocate me. While Denise played house with dolls, I memorized aircraft engines from library books. While other girls hung posters of rock stars, I taped photographs of F-14 Tomcats to my bedroom wall. Dad hated those posters. Looks ridiculous, he'd mutter whenever relatives visited. Mom tried harder to understand me, but even she seemed exhausted by the effort sometimes. You don't always have to prove something, she told me once. The trouble was, I wasn't trying to prove anything. Flying simply felt like the first honest thing I'd ever loved. Denise stirred cream into her coffee slowly. Were you really the only woman in your training class? Not the only one, I said. Just one of very few. And the men gave you trouble. I let out a dry laugh. That's one way to phrase it. She looked genuinely curious now, maybe for the first time in our lives, so I told her. Not everything. Some stories stay buried for a reason. But enough. I told her about flight school in Pensacola during the early 80s, about instructors who assumed women would wash out within weeks, about classmates who stopped talking when I entered briefing rooms, about the exhaustion. God, the exhaustion. People imagine military aviation as glamorous because of movies. They picture leather jackets and triumphant music. Reality is fluorescent lighting at 4 a.m. while someone twice your size critiques every mistake you make. Reality is studying until your eyes blur because one error in the sky can kill people. Reality is understanding that if you fail, some men will use your failure as evidence women never belonged there in the first place. Denise listened without interrupting. That sounds miserable. Some of it was. Then why stay? I thought about that carefully. Because quitting would have followed me forever. Because every cruel comment fueled me instead of stopping me. Because once I sat inside a fighter jet for the first time and felt those engines wake beneath me, there was no going back to ordinary life. You know what the strange part was? I said quietly. What? The sky was the easy part. Denise frowned slightly. People were harder. That seemed to hit her. Maybe because she realized she'd been part of that without meaning to. Growing up, Denise had always been the easy daughter to love. She married young, had children, hosted Christmas dinners, remembered birthdays. Meanwhile, I missed funerals because of deployments and forgot anniversaries because I lived by military calendars instead of civilian ones. Families forgive warmth more easily than absence. You know, Dad used to brag about you eventually, Denise said suddenly. I looked up sharply. He did. Not publicly, she smiled sadly, only when his friends weren't around. That hurt more than I expected. All those years I'd thought he was ashamed of me completely. Denise stared into her coffee. I think he just didn't know how to understand you. That's not the same thing as trying. No, she admitted quietly, it's not. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 a.m. Outside, cold rain drifted against the windows. You really never married because of the Navy, Denise asked. I smiled a little. That's the simplified version. There had been men. A few good ones. One almost became my husband back in 1989, naval aviator named Scott Brennan, smart, kind, loved jazz music and terrible diner coffee. He died during a training accident over the Atlantic 3 months before the wedding. After that, I stopped imagining permanent things. Denise covered her mouth softly. Oh my God. I'm all right. But even saying those words after 30 years still carried weight. The military teaches you to continue functioning after loss. It does not teach you how to stop carrying it. I had no idea, she whispered. Most people didn't. That was the pattern of my life, really. Invisible sacrifices, invisible grief, invisible service. And maybe that's why Trevor's joke hit harder than he realized. Not because it insulted my rank, because it erased decades of sacrifice with one careless sentence. Denise reached across the table slowly and touched my hand. I'm sorry too, she said. Simple words. Late words. But sincere. I squeezed her hand gently. You were living your life, I told her. So were you. Yes. She looked at me carefully then. And were you happy? That question caught me off guard. Because accomplishment and happiness are not always neighbors. I thought about roaring engines at sunrise, young pilots graduating under my instruction, lonely apartments near bases scattered across America. I thought about funerals, missed holidays, silence. Then I answered honestly. Sometimes. Denise nodded like she understood more than she wanted to. And maybe she did. By morning, nothing in that house had fully healed. But for the first time in decades, the truth had finally entered the room. The next morning I woke before sunrise out of habit. Some routines never leave you even after retirement. For 30 years my life had been measured by alarms in dark rooms, briefing schedules, flight plans, weather reports, and the sound of boots against concrete before dawn. Civilian life still felt slightly unnatural to me sometimes, like I was borrowing someone else's rhythm. Denise's house was quiet when I walked downstairs wearing jeans and an old navy sweatshirt faded nearly gray with age. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and burnt coffee from the automatic timer machine sputtering on the counter. Richard Hayes was already awake. Of course he was. Old Marines rarely sleep late. He sat alone at the table reading a newspaper with the posture of a man who still expected inspection at any moment. He looked up when I entered. Mornin', Commander. I smiled slightly. Retired, Commander? Still counts. He folded the paper carefully. Coffee. I've survived worse. That earned the first real laugh I'd heard from him. I poured myself a mug and sat across from him while soft November light crept through the kitchen windows. For a while we simply existed in companionable silence. Older people understand silence better than younger ones. We don't rush to fill every empty space anymore. Finally Richard spoke. You know Trevor's embarrassed. He'll survive. He's not a bad man. I didn't say he was. And I meant that. Trevor wasn't cruel at his core. Loud, insecure, thoughtless, sometimes yes, but not malicious. Men like Trevor often mistake confidence for volume because nobody ever taught them the difference. Richard rubbed one rough hand along his jaw. He grew up around stories about military service, he said. But stories and sacrifice aren't the same thing. Number. He thinks respecting veterans means bumper stickers and flag pins. I took a sip of coffee. A lot of Americans do. Richard studied me for a long moment. You're angry? That surprised me. Not because he noticed. Because I hadn't admitted it to myself until then. I looked down into the coffee mug. Yes, I said quietly. About Trevor. I shook my head slowly. About how easy it was. He frowned slightly. What was? For everyone to assume I couldn't possibly have done something difficult. The words came out calmer than I felt. That assumption follows women your whole life, especially women my age. I gave a small shrug. People see gray hair and politeness and suddenly decide you were never dangerous. Richard nodded slowly like he understood exactly what I meant. You know, he said, when I first saw you walk in yesterday, I noticed your posture immediately. That's hard to get rid of. No, he replied, but it told me something. I smiled faintly, that I spent too many years standing inspections. That you carried responsibility. Outside, rainwater dripped softly from the gutters. Richard leaned back in his chair. I heard stories about Iron Widow years ago. That old call sign still felt strange in civilian conversation. Most military nicknames sound ridiculous outside their original context. What kind of stories? I asked. That pilots cried after your evaluations. I laughed quietly into my coffee. Some did. And then they got better. Richard grinned. That's what I heard. I stared out the window for a moment, remembering. Young faces. Nervous hands. Cocky lieutenants pretending confidence before carrier qualifications. Kids, really. Most of them barely old enough to rent cars carrying machines worth millions of dollars onto pitching flight decks in darkness. People romanticize military aviation because they never see the fear. I saw it every day. That was my job. You know why instructors get hard? I asked quietly. Richard shook his head once. Because eventually you realize kindness can kill people. The kitchen went still. I continued carefully. If a pilot freezes during training, you correct it. If they get sloppy, you correct it. If they panic under pressure, you force them through it again and again until instinct replaces fear. Richard's expression darkened slightly. Because one day they'll need it for real. Yes. I stared down at my hands. And sometimes they still don't come home. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. There are certain truths veterans recognize without elaboration. Loss is one of them. Around 8 o'clock, the rest of the household slowly came alive upstairs. Footsteps, running water, cabinet doors opening. Then Trevor entered the kitchen. The confidence from yesterday was gone. Good. Embarrassment can be healthy if it teaches humility. He stood awkwardly near the doorway for a second before looking at me. Morning. Morning. Richard quietly folded his newspaper and stood. I'm gonna check the weather outside. The old Marine was giving us privacy. Subtle. Respectful. Trevor sat across from me after his father left. For a moment he looked younger somehow, less polished, less certain. My dad chewed me out for an hour last night, he admitted. I figured. He said I embarrassed myself. I sipped coffee calmly. Did you? He let out a breath through his nose. Probably. That was progress. He rubbed the back of his neck. I honestly thought you were exaggerating. Most people do. No, I mean... He hesitated. You just don't act like someone important. I almost laughed. There it was again. The misunderstanding. What does someone important act like? I asked. Trevor opened his mouth. Closed it again. Exactly. He looked embarrassed. I guess I expected... He searched for words. More ego. That's television, I said. He nodded slowly. Then after a pause, he asked something unexpected. Did people give you hell because you were a woman? I leaned back slightly. Constantly. He looked genuinely disturbed by that. Even after you proved yourself. Especially then. That seemed to shake him. I think for the first time in his life, Trevor realized competence doesn't protect people from prejudice. Sometimes it attracts more of it. He stared down at the kitchen table. My daughter wants to join the Air Force someday. I smiled faintly. Then teach her not to shrink herself for insecure men. He looked up sharply. Not defensive this time. Thoughtful. And suddenly I saw what Richard had probably been hoping for all along. Not punishment. Growth. Denise entered the kitchen carrying laundry a few minutes later and stopped short when she saw us talking peacefully. Well, she said carefully, this is less terrifying than yesterday. Trevor snorted softly. Low bar. She looked at me uncertainly. You okay? I nodded. Yes. And strangely enough, for the first time since arriving, I actually meant it. That afternoon, Denise insisted everybody take a walk after lunch. Fresh air will stop this family from killing each other, she announced. Nobody argued. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the neighborhood washed clean and smelling faintly of wet leaves and chimney smoke. Northern Virginia in late November always reminded me of old photographs, gray skies, bare trees, and people pretending winter wasn't already waiting around the corner. The grandchildren raced ahead down the sidewalk while the adults followed more slowly in pairs. Trevor walked beside me after a while, hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. You know, he said carefully, I looked you up last night. I glanced sideways at him. That dangerous, huh? He gave a nervous laugh. My dad said if I was going to open my mouth about military service, maybe I should educate myself first. Wise man. Trevor nodded. I found articles. That didn't surprise me much. Retirement ceremonies, defense newsletters, aviation publications. Bits and pieces of a career scattered across the internet like breadcrumbs. Most people simply never connected those stories to the quiet woman bringing cranberry sauce to Thanksgiving dinner. What kind of articles, I asked. One about carrier training. He hesitated. Another mentioned you received some kind of commendation after an accident investigation. I looked ahead toward the children. That was years ago. What happened? The memory arrived instantly. Heat. Smoke. A young pilot screaming into a radio. I exhaled slowly through my nose. Mechanical failure during training exercises. Trevor waited. The pilot survived. But barely. He nodded quietly. That was another thing civilians sometimes misunderstood about military life. Survival was not the same thing as escaping unharmed. We walked another 20 feet before Trevor spoke again. My dad said instructors carry guilt for people who die. I stopped walking for a second. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk in cold wind. Yes, I said softly. Trevor's expression shifted immediately, like he realized he'd stumbled onto something heavier than curiosity. I'm sorry, he said quickly. You don't have to apologize for asking. But I appreciated that he cared enough to hesitate. That mattered. We kept walking. Across the street, someone had already put up Christmas lights, even though Thanksgiving wasn't over yet. Red and green reflections shimmered faintly against wet pavement. Trevor glanced toward the grandchildren. Did you lose students? There it was. The real question. I kept my eyes forward. Yes. His face tightened. How many? I stopped counting. That answer silenced him completely. Not because the number shocked him, because he finally understood there was one. People over 60 know something younger people often don't. The older you get, the less impressive glory becomes and the more meaningful endurance feels. Trevor had spent years admiring military imagery. Flags, jets, uniforms. But now he was beginning to see the human cost underneath the symbolism. We returned to the house about half an hour later. Denise started preparing sandwiches while football commentators shouted from the television. The grandchildren disappeared upstairs with tablets and blankets. Ordinary American family life? And somehow that normalcy made the conversation feel even heavier. Richard found me later in the den studying old framed family photos on the bookshelf. You were 21 there, he said, pointing toward a picture of me in dress whites. 22. You looked angry. I was. He laughed quietly. Fair enough. I picked up the frame carefully. That photograph had been taken the day I completed advanced flight training. My father had attended the ceremony wearing a stiff gray suit and the expression of a man pretending support because public embarrassment would look worse. "You know what he said afterward?" I asked. Richard shook his head. "He told me maybe now I'd grow out of this phase." Richard closed his eyes briefly. Christ. I think he genuinely believed military service would eventually make me softer somehow. I smiled faintly. Instead, it made me harder. Richard leaned against the bookshelf. "Hard isn't always bad." "No," I admitted, "but it gets lonely." That word hung between us. Lonely. There it was. Not heroic. Not cinematic. Just true. People imagine loneliness as empty apartments and quiet nights. But the deepest loneliness comes from being fundamentally misunderstood by people who've known you your whole life. Denise entered the room carrying folded towels. "You two look serious again." "We're old," Richard replied. "It's our favorite hobby." She smiled before sitting beside me on the couch. "I've been thinking about something," she said carefully. "That sounds dangerous." She nudged my shoulder lightly. "I mean it." I looked at her. "When Mom got sick," Denise hesitated, "why didn't you come sooner?" "Ah, that wound." The hardest ones are always family questions asked 20 years too late. "I was deployed," I answered quietly. "You came eventually." "Yes, but not until the end." There was no accusation in her voice, which somehow made it worse. I stared at the family photo in my hands. The Navy denied my leave twice. Denise blinked. "What?" "We were short pilots." Her face fell completely. "You never told me that." "What good would it have done?" "You could have explained." I gave a tired smile. "To who, Dad? The relatives already calling me selfish." Denise looked down at her hands. "Because she remembered. The whispers during Mom's final weeks. Poor Margaret, one daughter here every day, the other chasing airplanes. Funny how people build entire moral judgments around information they never bothered verifying." "I thought you chose not to come," Denise whispered. "No," I said gently. "I chose not to defend myself anymore." The room went quiet. Richard looked angry now, though not at me. "You carried that alone." I shrugged. "Military families do it all the time." Denise's eyes filled with tears. "Oh God, Evie." I touched her arm softly before she could spiral into guilt. "You loved Mom," I said. "That mattered more than misunderstandings." "But you loved her too." "Yes?" And there it was again. The truth nobody had ever fully seen. I had sacrificed family moments for service. But I had also sacrificed service for family every chance I could. And somehow still ended up disappointing both worlds sometimes. Trevor appeared quietly in the doorway then. He looked hesitant, like a man realizing the story he mocked was much bigger than his pride. "I owe you more than an apology," he said carefully. I looked at him calmly. "Maybe." He nodded once. Then, after a pause, "I think I owe you respect." That one felt different. Because respect offered voluntarily means something, especially from a man finally learning humility. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Richard Hayes called me on a Tuesday morning while I was reorganizing tools in my garage. Retirement does strange things to people. After decades of operating at high speed, you suddenly find yourself spending 30 minutes deciding where to hang a wrench. "Evelyn," Richard said over the phone, "you busy Saturday night?" I had plans to aggressively avoid social interaction. He laughed. "I'm serious." "So am I." That old Marine chuckled again before his tone softened. "I'd like you to come to the Veterans Relief Gala." I leaned against the workbench. "Richard, hear me out first." I already knew the event he meant. Annual fundraiser outside Arlington for veteran families, military widows, and disabled service members. The kind of formal gathering filled with donated wine, patriotic speeches, and retired officers pretending not to compare ribbons. Not exactly my natural habitat anymore. "You'd hate it," he admitted honestly, "which is why I know you're the right person to invite." That logic feels questionable. "I'm old, humor me." I sighed. "Why me?" The line went quiet for a second. "Because too many loud people get celebrated these days," he said. "I'd rather honor someone who actually carried weight." That answer sat heavily in my chest. Nobody had ever spoken about my career that way before. Not publicly. Not personally. After we hung up, I stood alone in the garage for a long time, staring at dust floating through cold morning sunlight. Then eventually I whispered the same thing I'd whispered before difficult flights for 30 years. All right. Saturday evening arrived cold and clear. I wore a simple black dress with a navy blazer instead of formal military attire. My dress uniform still hung preserved in garment bags upstairs, but I had no interest in becoming a walking museum exhibit for one evening. The gala was held at an old hotel ballroom overlooking the Potomac. Warm lights glowed against polished wood floors, while a jazz trio played softly near the entrance. Mostly older crowd. Gray hair. Slow steps. Veterans. Widows. Children of service members. People who understood sacrifice without needing it explained dramatically. I spotted Denise first near the registration table. She hugged me tightly the moment I walked in. "You look beautiful," she said. "You look nervous." "I am nervous." "Why?" She smiled weakly. "Because Richard refuses to tell me what he's planning." That worried me immediately. Oh no. Before she could answer, Trevor approached from across the room wearing a dark suit and the uncomfortable expression of a man attending his own sentencing hearing. "Hey," he said carefully. "Hey." He shoved his hands into his pockets. "I just wanted to say, thanks for coming." "That bad, huh?" He actually smiled a little. "You have no idea." Richard finally appeared near the ballroom entrance wearing a Marine Corps blazer that somehow made him stand straighter than men 20 years younger. When he saw me, his face softened warmly. "There she is." Richard I warned immediately, "If this evening includes public embarrassment, I'm stealing your cane." "You wouldn't dare." "I flew tactical aircraft off moving ships. Test me." That made him laugh hard enough to cough. The evening itself began quietly enough. Dinner, speeches, charity auctions, stories about military families holding themselves together through deployments and grief and impossible years. Real stories. Not Hollywood nonsense. At some point during dessert, Richard stepped onto the small stage near the ballroom windows and tapped the microphone gently. The room settled. "I know everybody's tired of old men talking," he began, "but indulge me a few minutes more." Polite laughter rolled through the ballroom. Richard looked directly toward me. "Most military celebrations focus on visible leadership," he said. "Decorated commanders, public heroes, the names people recognize." His voice grew quieter. "But some of the most important people in military history are almost completely unknown outside the people they trained." My stomach dropped immediately. "Oh, Richard. You sneaky old Marine." Across the room, Trevor gave me an apologetic look, like he suddenly realized what was happening too late to stop it. Richard continued calmly. "Several weeks ago during Thanksgiving dinner, my son embarrassed himself by mocking a woman who spent decades quietly serving this country." Now the ballroom had gone fully silent. I considered climbing out a nearby window. "She never asked for recognition," Richard said, "which is exactly why she deserves it." Then he looked directly at me. "Commander Evelyn Carter, would you stand, please?" God help me. Slowly, reluctantly, I stood. And then something unexpected happened. Several older men across the ballroom straightened immediately. One man near the back whispered "Iron Widow" under his breath. Another veteran stood up first. Then another. And another. Not applause at first. Recognition. The kind earned quietly over years. A retired pilot near the stage approached me slowly with tears already gathering in his eyes. "You probably don't remember me," he said. I looked carefully at his face. Older now, gray-haired, heavy around the shoulders. But familiar. "Danny Ruiz," I said softly. His laugh broke halfway into a sob. "Jesus Christ, you really do remember." "I remember every pilot who almost killed my blood pressure." The room laughed warmly. Danny wiped his eyes quickly. "You failed me twice during carrier qualification. You were reckless. You saved my life." The ballroom went still again. Danny looked around the room before continuing. "I was 24 years old and thought confidence mattered more than discipline." He swallowed hard. 2 years later, combat hit, and every correction she drilled into me kept me alive. Nobody spoke. Because there are moments older Americans recognize instinctively as sacred. Truth was one of them. Danny looked at me again. "You taught us how to come home." I honestly didn't know what to say to that. After all those years, all those funerals, all those lonely nights wondering whether any of it mattered. Suddenly the weight felt visible. Trevor stepped forward then, his face pale, voice unsteady. I need to say something too. The room turned toward him. He looked directly at me. A few weeks ago I made fun of someone because I judged her before understanding her. He swallowed hard. Truth is, I felt insecure around things I didn't understand. Nobody moved. Trevor took a breath. I thought being loud made me important. His eyes dropped briefly. I was wrong. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I believed him. The drive home from the gala felt strangely peaceful. Not triumphant. Not dramatic. Just quiet. At my age, I'd learned that real closure rarely arrives with fireworks. Most healing enters softly like evening light through old curtains. The highway south was nearly empty. Christmas lights glowed from distant neighborhoods, while old holiday songs drifted through the radio low enough not to interrupt my thoughts. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. And oddly enough, that realization hurt a little. Because once people finally saw me clearly, I couldn't stop wondering how different life might have been if they'd bothered sooner. A few days later, Denise called asking if I'd come for Christmas. Not out of obligation. Not because Richard insisted. Because she wanted me there. That distinction mattered. I don't want you staying at a hotel this time, she said firmly over the phone. You're family. Family. Such a simple word for something so complicated. I arrived Christmas Eve carrying a pecan pie from a roadside bakery and fully expecting awkwardness. Instead, Trevor opened the front door wearing an apron dusted with flour. I'm on biscuit duty, he announced solemnly. Pray for everyone. I laughed before I could stop myself. And just like that, something shifted. Not erased. Not magically repaired. But softened. The grandchildren swarmed the living room floor, surrounded by wrapping paper and battery-operated chaos. Denise had decorated the house with old-fashioned colored lights, instead of the blinding white ones everyone uses now. The whole place felt warmer. More honest somehow. Richard sat near the fireplace wearing a thick cardigan and reading glasses while pretending not to supervise everybody. You're late, he grumbled as I walked in. I was avoiding your cooking. That was one time. One traumatic time. He pointed a crooked finger at me. Still disrespectful. The family laughed. And hearing myself inside that laughter instead of outside, it felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. Later that evening after dinner, dishes were stacked, and the grandchildren disappeared upstairs with new toys. Trevor handed me a glass of wine and motioned toward the back porch. Cold winter air greeted us outside. The neighborhood glowed softly beneath Christmas lights and quiet suburban darkness. Trevor leaned against the railing. You know, he said, I used to think confidence meant always having something to say. I smiled faintly. That explains a lot. He laughed softly. Fair. For a moment we simply stood there listening to distant wind moving through bare trees. Then his expression grew serious again. I owe you another apology. Trevor. No, listen. His voice carried none of the defensiveness from Thanksgiving. Only honesty. I spent years teaching my son to respect veterans. He shook his head slowly, but I never realized respect also means shutting up long enough to learn who people really are. That one landed deep. Because it wasn't just about military service anymore. It was about life. About aging. About how many older Americans quietly carry histories nobody around them ever notices. I looked out across the neighborhood. When you get older, I said softly, people start assuming your story is already finished. Trevor nodded slowly. But it's not. Number. He glanced toward me carefully. You ever regret it? The Navy. Everything. That question deserved honesty. I thought about Scott Brennan. Carrier decks at sunrise. Lonely apartments. Missed funerals. Young pilots surviving because of lessons I screamed into them during training. I thought about my father dying before truly understanding me. And Denise finally trying. I regret some costs, I admitted quietly, but not the service. Trevor looked relieved by that answer for reasons I couldn't entirely understand. Inside the house, laughter echoed faintly through the windows. Warm. Human. Temporary. The older you get, the more you treasure temporary things. When we returned inside, Richard waved me toward the dining table where his grandson Luke sat hunched over a model airplane kit. The boy looked up nervously. "Aunt Evelyn?" he asked. "Yes." His cheeks reddened slightly. "Mom says you flew fighter jets." "I did." He hesitated. "I want to fly someday too." Trevor immediately opened his mouth, then stopped himself. "Growth." I hid a smile. "What kind of flying?" I asked Luke. "Air Force, maybe." He glanced at the little plastic airplane in his hands, or Navy. I pulled out a chair beside him. "Then learn humility early." He blinked. "That's the secret." "One of them." I pointed gently toward the unfinished model airplane. "Machines don't care about ego. The sky doesn't either." Luke listened carefully, the way children do when they know an adult is finally giving them the real answer instead of a polished one. "You know what makes people dangerous?" I asked. He shook his head. "Thinking they're too smart to learn." Across the room, Richard smiled quietly into his coffee. The evening slowed after that. Old movies on television. Half-asleep grandchildren under blankets. Denise humming softly in the kitchen while wrapping leftovers in foil. Ordinary moments. And somehow, after a lifetime of extraordinary pressure and responsibility, ordinary finally felt precious. Before bed, I found myself alone at the kitchen sink washing dishes while snow began falling lightly outside the window. Denise walked in carrying another stack of plates. "You don't have to do those," she said. "I know." She stood beside me drying dishes quietly for a moment before speaking again. "I used to think your life was sad." I looked at her gently. "And now?" She smiled through tears gathering in her eyes. "I think it was brave." That nearly broke me. Not because I needed praise, because after 62 years, my sister finally saw me clearly. And maybe that's all most people really want before the end of their story. To be seen truthfully. Not perfectly. Just truthfully. If this story reminded you of someone whose sacrifices went unnoticed for too long, maybe reach out to them while you still can. Sometimes respect arrives late, but it still matters when it comes from the heart. And if you believe quiet strength deserves to be remembered too, I hope you'll stay for more stories like this.